but I can't read, I can't write, I can't spell, and most of the time I don't know my left from my right.
Now here's the thing about me that's a secret that most people don't know. I'm borderline retarded, and I can't read. These books that you're recommending,
Goethe.
I would pick that up and I would be like, 10 minutes later, I'd be like, what's my favorite song? The ABCs?
I think we're kind of getting off topic. Can you name 10 books?
Keep going back to me. Can you?
Don't change.
No.
10 books.
You're changing the subject, actually.
10 books.
You're changing the subject,
Okay,
actually.
3 books.
Okay. Well, the Game of Thrones series,
not a book.
Twilight
I
series.
want the name
It
of
is
the
a book. It is a book.
Dress your age. Carrying a school bag on stage. What are you doing with a school bag on stage? You can't even read.
All right, how's everyone doing tonight? We got a lot of people filing in right now. That's our new intro. How you feeling about that intro, Prude?
It feels exactly what the show should cover, which is that it is two retards asking the same question every couple of weeks. Do you even read?
And we're doing a bad advertisement for reading because I think one of my favorite ones is the first one we ever did, but we've made a habit of only reading books that at best break people's minds, at worst confuse and frustrate them. And this book in question, which is part 2 of what we're going to be talking about, Anti-Oedipus. I think we were pretty clear on it last time. There's a lot of questions, but this one's going to tie a lot of them together and leave you with even more questions, is my belief. What do you think about that? I'm kind of jumping into it right now, but we could do a bit of a preamble. There's a lot going on in America these days, and people could be anywhere else in the world. They could be watching any stream, any take, but you're here with us.
You're here with us, and Capitalissimo likes to say that intro is really insensitive to the illiterate, but what can they do? It's not like they can read the title of the stream anyway, so it's all right. We're here for a good time and a good evening. We're here to go through a book that will answer, as Dimes has just said. We're going to answer your questions from the first stream, but we're going to leave you with a lot more at the end, because that's what we like to do. And I think that it's perfectly fitting that this show is called Do You Even Read? Because when you had messaged me the other week, you had said, oh, the new episode of Dyer is up. And I was like, you know what? That's really fitting for this show, because not only are we going to dive into some esoteric texts, but just like Jay Dyer, we're going to get angry and we're going to leave you with more questions than answers. So I hope you're strapped in for a good time.
And guess what? We're not going to be rapping. We're not going to be doing a Jay Dyer type rap, which every time I see a Jay Dyer clip, let me just say this: who doesn't love Jay Dyer? However, it's all rapping. I just seem to get rapping clips for him, which it might have soured him a bit for me.
EL's got a good point here. He says this book is more confusing than your sexuality, Dimes, and he says homo curious in there. Well, don't worry, we're going to have answers to all that and more in
There's
this
so many
episode.
chats he could have called out. He could have called out a whole stream of them. Here, look here's a good one that would have the Sneed for Read. What a nice.
You should make that a sticker for the Good Suffer store.
I think Sneed might be over. I got accused. I said Sneed in a chat full of like younger, like Gen Z, and they almost laughed me out of the fucking room. They said Sneed's done. What are you doing, old man?
There are guys still making quality musical parody shit posts about Sneed. I refuse. It's not dead. It's like punk rock. It's never dead. Punk isn't dead.
I still love it. But I'm old as shit now. I still think old memes are funny.
My birthday is in a week. I feel old as shit.
Are you allowed to say how old you are?
Oh, I turned 29 in a week.
Oh, 29. Wow. You're pretty young though. It's not over yet.
Yeah, it's over. It's over. It's over.
Once you hit 30, like a light switch gets flicked in your brain and you become an anti-hero. That's the best way I can see it. Like you're not impressed by anything anymore. Everything, you get it.
What you're telling me is that I turn into Shania Twain when I turn in 30 that don't impress me much.
Yes. See, you are a millennial. You get no one's making Shania Twain references as a young man. You're in this with me now. We're talking Sneed. We're talking Shania Twain references. We're talking old memes. You want me I miss? I liked when people were saying skeletons don't exist. I think that's funny and charming.
I do miss all the spooky, scary skeleton memes. I'm not going to lie.
Oh, here's Dimes isn't currently gay. I just read the first part of this comment. Isn't currently gay. Thank you. I'm just up to no good. I want to make it clear that Dimes is not currently gay. See, look at that. A wholesome comment. I feel good. I feel I got a joie de vivre about me. Okay, Seneca says Prude is so old. LMAO. We still love you though. It only gets better from here. At the very worst, it levels off.
I just passed the great filter of American high school. I made it. Congratulations on not ending up like a certain CEO. Congrats for making out of American high school without getting shot. We're really proud of you. Thank you for meeting the bare minimum societal expectations as a white person. So let's get into the book here, Dimes.
Yeah, we're gonna end up talking about high school all day. So there's 3 pillars that I think we're gonna hit or try to hit on this episode. Now, people recall the first episode we discussed. What did we discuss? It was what the fuck did we discuss?
We discussed desiring production and what does it mean to be in a production society, as well as a body without organs.
It was the face. So desiring machines and the body without organs, which is almost like the schematic for this whole thing. But what we didn't talk about was Oedipus, and what we didn't talk about was how capitalism fits in all this. And Prude very intelligently said we should probably start with that. Now, I've got both copies of the book pulled up here because we both use different reference copies. So I can pull those up on the screen right now. Let me just...
If you could pull up the one I sent you, because that's the one I've got in front of me. And I am on page 240, which is 133 on the PDF, good sir. So see, there we go. We've got our Dimes as our very own Jamie. We've got it all set and going.
Here we go. Now, some people might not be able to read this. I'm going to zoom in as best I can. It's a pretty dense book, but just try and follow along. So we're going to start with capitalism because, even when I was reading it, it's easy to miss the capitalist parts and get drawn into all the psychiatry parts. Because as we said in the first one, this entire worldview really grows from psychiatry, even though it's kind of critiquing psychiatry. It lives within the psychiatric framework and it can never remove itself from that. However, now we're going to get a bit economical.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important when reading this book that this is throwing Marx and Freud into a blender and then trying to come up with their criticisms from a continental but also a post-structuralist perspective. And if you're not acknowledging that, then you're missing out. But the spine's closed. I guess it's got CNS AIDS, I have to laugh as a slight aside before we go into this, that I still think it's funny as hell. A few weeks ago, the Urbanomics, the guys that published Thomas Moynihan's books, they had added my Twitter account and linked our very first episode of Do You Even Read, which covered spinal catastrophism. And they were like, Mr. Prudentialist covers it here. And I'm like, I'm the last person you people ever want covering your books. And you said it so perfectly when we first started doing the show that we are the righties are the only one reading your shit. We're the only ones reading your books. I hate to break it to you. To all you lovely anarcho-kitties, to all you post-structuralists out there, it's those awful chuds. We're the only ones reading your stuff.
Well, also, just to build on that, if you don't mind, I had a question from a guy named Mark Trouble from our community. He'd asked a question. He said, where does all this talk of Deleuze come from? It seems like over the past 5 or so years, I'm hearing a lot about him. He hadn't read him, but he just heard him in the zeitgeist. And in my opinion, it was the popularity of Slavoj Žižek. Because with Žižek, I think is the only culturally relevant intellectual from the left. And I mean like full admitted hard left, calls himself a communist, calls himself a Stalinist. But he's the guy that people actually think is like a celebrity. And with Žižek, he brings along all that Deleuze and all that Jacques Lacan and all that stuff. So to me, that's how it got so popular. Just building on that. But I don't think, and I'm not trying to sound dismissive when I say this, I don't think most people on the left have ever read either of these things or even read Žižek. And they'd be proud of that, right? We covered one Žižek book on my show, Blood Satellite, a while ago, But it wouldn't surprise me most people hadn't read it. And just to your point you're making, I think it's only guys like us who are not only reading these, but seriously reading it and trying to not just pick it apart and be a James Lindsay about it and just say, hey, look at this kooky nonsense. Or like I remember What If Alt Hist, who's a pretty popular account, like he famously was like reading Hegel and he's like, I had to give up because it was just factually incorrect. I'm like, okay, if you're just saying Hegel is stupid, you're not taking it seriously, right? Or if you're saying he gets the facts wrong, like, no, that means you haven't allowed yourself to actually get inside of it. So I think really it's only freaks like us who are doing this.
Well, with that being said, I think it's a good time to finally to get into it. We'll just go right down into it, and we'll just start from the top here. Because like I just told Dimes before we went live, I said it'd be really a dick move of us not to talk about capitalism when the subtitle of this book is called Capitalism and Schizophrenia. So we'll just start from the top. Writing has never been capitalism's thing. Capitalism is profoundly illiterate. The death of writing is like the death of God or the death of the Father. The thing was settled a long time ago, although the news of the event is slow to reach us, and there survives in us the memory of extinct signs in which we still write. The reason for this is simple. Writing implies a use of language in general according to a graphism which becomes aligned on the voice, but also overcodes it and includes a fictitious voice from on high that functions as a signifier. The arbitrary nature of the thing designated, the subordination of the consecutive, the subordination of the signified, the transcendence of the despotic signifier, and finally its consecutive decomposition into minimal elements within a field of evidence that writing belongs to imperial despotic representation. There's already a lot in there. I'm immediately thinking about Harold Innis and communication and the way in which empires have a certain form of communication, which is, time-based, constantly repeating.
Yeah, and that's something that came up in my mind as I was reading this as well. Like we had said previously, you're going to find a lot of good stuff buried in here, a lot of interesting starting points, and maybe some descriptions of capitalism that actually do track and make sense.
Yeah, we're going to get into that in a little more in just a second here. But also we're going to get into one of our favorite people to talk about in just a second. Once this is said, what is exactly meant when someone announces the collapse of the, quote, Gutenberg galaxy? Of course, capitalism has made and continues to make use of writing. Not only is writing adapted to money as the general equivalent, but specific functions of money in capitalism went by the way of writing and printing, and in some measure continue to do so. The fact nonetheless remains that writing typically plays a role in an archaism in capitalism, as the Gutenberg press, being the element that confers on the archaism a current function. But the capitalist use of language is different in nature. It is realized or becomes concrete within the field of immanence peculiar to capitalism itself, with the appearance of the technical means of expression that correspond to the generalized decoding of flows, instead of still referring in a direct or indirect form to despotic overcoding. This seems to us to be the significance of McLuhan's analysis, to have shown what a language of decoded flows is, as opposed to a signifier that strangles and overcodes the flows. In the first place, for non-signifying language, anything will do, whether it be phonic, graphic, gestural, etc. No flow is privileged in this language, which remains indifference to its substance or support, inasmuch as the latter is an amorphous continuum. The electric flow can be considered as the realization of such a flow that is indeterminate as such. But a substance is said to be formed when a flow enters into a relationship with one another, and such a flow that first defines a content and then second an expression. The deterritorialized flows of content and expression are in a state of conjunction or reciprocal precondition that constitutes figures as the ultimate units of both content and expression.
There's a few ideas there that I think need to be established that might not make sense to people. That would make more sense if you read the entire book from beginning to end. When he talks about decoded flows, and we might have mentioned this on the last episode, but when you talk about and correct me if I'm wrong, because I might butcher this, like a flow is sort of when you have these desiring machines, which once again are basically everything. Everything is made up of desiring machines. That's what nature is at its base level before we build and code in all this other stuff into it. But it's sort of like the anarchic chaos of nature that constitutes us. Then those machines communicate with each other with flows of information. So that's like an uncoded flow. And then these flows become coded. So in this sense, when we talk about Harold Innis, there's this idea of, just so people can recall, think of, the center of power as, the imperial center or the federal government, and then there's concentric circles going out, where the periphery of society would be the fringe. The fringe, the periphery of society, they tend to use different sorts of language, different sorts of communication methods that are optimized more for travel and impermanence and just speed and experimentation. At the center, it's more forms of communication for longevity that are time oriented rather than space oriented. So those would be statues, those would be like intense codified legal structures, and across time these take different forms. So that's kind of what he's talking about there. Like, oh, you have these less coded forms of communication, more fluid, more energetic. Things become more coded the more systematized they are. And I think that's what he's really trying to get at. And you'll see this theme recurring in the book, that something being over coded is over systematized, or there's too many rules, there's too many, it's anti natural fluid chaos. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And also and this is where you would see like, let's use America as an example to sort of blow off on that and to expand it. So you have Washington, D.C. as its imperial capital, but you also have these peripheries. You have like Nova, you have parts of the federal government that have its offices elsewhere. They communicate via edict, they communicate often. We see this especially with how one can look at, say, wokeness as an example. You can talk about it as a mind virus, but it is very top-down forms of communication. And a mutual friend of ours, Jeff Deist, he used to be part of the Mises Institute and is also, was the former chief of staff for Ron Paul. He has a great article about this, where you see how these top-down distortions of language are, in fact, the parts in which tyranny arises in sort of the modern classical liberal sense. And we see this with Harold Innis as well. And so for Deleuze and Guattari, specifically, when they're talking about flows, our natural state is all things are about flowing things. Their entire idea of society is a generalized understanding that all things flow, and that all of our flows are coded, and we have to go this way because that's how we're structured by, in Deleuze and Guattari's view, this oppressive force of fascism, this oppressive force of capitalism. Flows are goods, services, ideas. They're transmitted from one to another. And what we're seeing here is that they're now oppressed. When we're talking about things that are now given expression, and things have content and meaning. And that's how things are coded into grammar, the rules of phonics, alphabets, and what eventually, as they'll break down in this chapter, forms in which capitalism, in their view, operates and works, and what we take for granted in our day-to-day society in the West.
Yeah, and he starts to build this idea that when you code a flow or try and give form to it, or a rule or morality or whatever, you start segmenting it, you give it a form, and capitalism is just the ultimate end state of that, because they still view capitalism the same way any other leftist or Marxist would, which is a drive towards segmentation of the classes, but not only just the classes, the segmentation and fragmentation of specialty. So everything in society is segmented and stacked and systematized and put into a hierarchy. So to them, and remember, I think we discussed this at the last episode, to them, everything in nature is fascistic. Fascism in this model is just some would say, inevitable drive towards systematization of itself. Everything ends up a hierarchy. Everything ends up oppressed. And so, of course, capitalism would emerge as the ultimate mode of that, which is the monetization of that and the systematization of that system. That's, in my view, what he's saying. And so, we made a joke, not a joke last time, I think it was just a fact, that in their model, fascism is natural. It is the natural world. It is inevitable. But that's why this book exists. And I believe their sequel, 1,000 Plateaus, which is to deconstruct that at the most fundamental atomic level.
Yeah, and as we kind of mentioned at the introduction of this book, when this first came out in its English translation, one of the forewords was written by Michel Foucault, and he basically had described this book as sort of a ethics and a way of life to resist capitalism, but also to resist the inner fascist that lurks inside of all of us. So the point is that, you know, for capitalist representation and for Deleuze and Guattari, like we're seeing how things are coded in language and in writing that enforce structures and enforce social norms. And earlier in this, and if you've read this whole thing from cover to cover, and we're not going to go through the whole thing because this one's a little heavier to deal with than, say, spinal catastrophism, but that, you know, these parts of flows allow us to have blockages to information and to things now being specifically encoded that are bad. So, you know, being with your sister or being with your mother is a bad thing because, you know, there's obvious social and genetic implications for that. It's also bad for us to have certain taboos with respects to the dead or with respects to the youth and with respects to the systems of hierarchies, whether it be the church, whether it be the state, whether it be the military. And in doing so, these blockages of flows now orient society towards a way in which their desire to produce things are now made in the direction that benefits the bourgeoisie, that benefits the hierarchies that we see established, and thus allows it to be, as, you know, Marx had critiqued about certain forms of, you know, capital, it becomes this self-correcting system in which fascism always stays on top.
Sorry, I didn't mute myself. Apparently, I'm breathing too heavily into the mic.
Just a tad.
Well, I'm trying to ride the volume here. I don't know what's going on. Maybe there's a third person on the stream. Maybe it's fucking Gio, by the way, who was supposed to be here. Everyone who was expecting Gio, unfortunately, he was called away. He read some news about his e-girl wife and had to go tend to that, of course. So, do you want to move on from the capitalism part here?
If we could go down into page 244, just a little bit down at the very beginning where it says civilization is defined, because this is a really important section, because this allows us to go into the direction towards schizophrenia.
Sorry, let me just make sure I'm at the right part here. So
135 on the PDF.
134. There we go. Okay.
Okay, cool. It's at the very bottom, and then I'll go back to the top. He says, they write, civilization is defined by the decoding and deterritorialization of flows in capitalist production. Any method will do for ensuring this universal decoding, the privatization brought to bear on property, goods, and the means of production, but also on the organs of private man himself, the abstraction of monetary quantities, but also the abstraction of the quantity of labor, the limitless nature of the relationship between capital and labor capacity, between the flows of financing and the flows of incomes or the means of payment, the scientific and technical form assumed by flows of code themselves, the formation of floating configurations starting from the lines and points without a discernible identity. The route taken by the decoded flows is traced by recent monetary history, the role of the dollar, short-term migrating capital, the floating of currencies, the new means of financing and credit, the special drawing rights, and the new form of crises and speculations. Our societies exhibit a marked taste for all codes foreign and exotic, but this taste is destructive and morbid. While decoding doubtless means understanding and translating a code, it also means destroying the code as such, by assigning it in an archaic, folkloric, and residual function, which makes psychoanalysis and ethnology two disciplines highly regarded in our modern societies. It would be a serious error to consider the capitalist flows and the schizophrenic flows as identical under the general theme of decoding the flows of desire. Their affinity is great, to be sure. Everywhere capitalism sets in motion schizo flows that animate our arts and our sciences, just as they congeal into the production of our own sick, the schizophrenics. We have seen the relationship of schizophrenia and capitalism went far beyond the problems of the modes of living, environment, ideology, etc., and that it should be examined at the deepest level as one and the same economy, one and the same production process. Our society produces schizos the same way it produces Prel shampoo or Ford cars, the only difference being that schizos are not saleable. How then does one explain the fact that capitalist production is constantly arresting these schizophrenic processes and transforming the subject of the process into a confined clinical entity, as though it saw in this process the image of its own death coming from within? A lot to break down there.
There's a lot to break down there. Also, yeah, when we were talking about Innes before, he mentioned there that, you know, once you code something, you begin to kill it. And by kill it, you mean kind of freeze it in time. And there's going to be an example given later in one of the parts that I coded. But this is pulled from Innes as well, in the description of a literate culture versus an oral culture. And he tends to hold up these oral cultures, tribal cultures, as closer to what he's talking about, closer to nature, not completely removed from the drive towards capitalism. But I remember when Innes was describing, you know, and even McLuhan as well, these societies, more savage ones, where there is less of a hierarchy. You could call it longhouse society. That's another way to put it, where the everything is a lot more lateral, everything is more fluid, identities are flow into each other. You know, there might be a tribal head, but families and friends, everything was a lot more intertwined. And there wasn't even a conceptualization of time, really. You would have something like cyclical time. Mircea Eliade talks about this in The Myth of the Eternal Return as well. But there was this idea that everything was more holistic. Everything was more synthesized, and we didn't begin to segment everything like we do now. So when he talks about, you know, everything being, you know, more holistic and everything flowing together, that's kind of what he's calling back to as well. Now, the problem is, once you go that far back in time, a lot of it does tend to get speculative. The thing about oral cultures is they don't fucking write anything down. So they really exist as examples for us, but some of them are very barely understood, in my opinion. Especially like if you want to go really deep back, like Julian Jaynes does in the breakdown of the bicameral mind, like or even Richard Gans and originary theory. Like you're kind of just you might as well be dealing in mythology at that point, because there's no hard evidence. So I remember when I was at the Toronto event I spoke at just recently, I'd mentioned that I mentioned this book, and there's a couple chuckles in the room. So I guess even a few Do You Even Read fans got there. But I was saying that this book was sort of the prototype for Substack writers now, because it plays fast and loose with a lot of different things. And the question that was asked to the panel I was on was, you know, what say you to the claim that people on the right employ more poetry in their writing? And I said, well, I'm not even sure I would agree with that. But, you know, and I mentioned Anti-Oedipus, like you do see a lot of writers on Substack, they're pulling in theory and history and pop culture and fucking song lyrics, and they're kind of tying it together with poetry, just like this book. So sometimes I do detect in their understanding of capitalism, it gets so far from anything economic, and then it's talking about a lot of different things and trying to smash them together, that I don't even think the authors care if it completely fits together. And that's one big stumbling block people have with this book. Like, you kind of just need to let it wash over you. If you start picking it apart, you will find where there's like huge swings that they're taking with, you know, both history and theory. But the stuff that does have a firm backing, in my opinion, is the stuff about Harold Innis and McLuhan, and what firm history there is here.
Yeah, and the way that they answer this question about like the death from within is because for Deleuze and Guattari, capitalism is the, you know, crystallization. It's the limitation that is inside of all societies, because once you assign flow, once you assign answers, terms, definitions, specific dogma, doctrine, taboo, meaning, positive or negative association with certain ideas of society, all forms of social formation freeze around those ideas, and those become the relative ways in which we understand the world. And once those, you know, axioms begin to break down, then society can truly be deterritorialized and de-individuated in a way in which there is no power. We are finally free from this desire to produce, and in doing so, this is why they say that capital always tries to find a way to monetize it. And if it cannot be monetized, it assigns negative flows. It assigns certain codes and implications such as taboo, or as what Deleuze and Guattari were just talking about, as, oh, well, these things can't be sold, ergo, we have to treat them as the ill, the sick, and doing so, because this is how we try and get away Marxist understandings of capitalism, and we have to find a way for us to actually question the world in a way that allows us to no longer take the revolutionary potential of a decoded, anarchic state, but instead allows us to have identity, and it allows us to build into a society that will have hierarchy, language, and putting itself in a way that produces things. And for Deleuze and Guattari, this is a terrible place to be, because this is where capitalism replaces codes with another, but instead, it creates a moral impossibility, because we still have to deal with certain problems in society, which is dealing with criminals, getting places where people can live, and assigning and re-territorializing people so that the system itself can endure. And this is where you can really start critiquing the work writ large, because, well, if we decode things, if we try to deterritorialize, in their view, these capitalist forms of structure, these encoded flows of information in societal formations, well, then what do we get? Well, turns out we don't get anarchy. Turns out we don't get this sort of anti-fascist utopia. What you do get is you get fucking Minneapolis in 2020. What you do get is, basically Haiti. And for them, they don't really get into that too much, because they're looking at this way too far, in my personal opinion, abstractly. But I think that that's sort of the thing to look at here, is that for them, coding information, coding the flow of information, whether it's indirect, qualitative, quantitative, limited, for them, this is purely a way in which you can assign value, taboo, praise, and code things so that there is specific hierarchy and connotation to all forms of society. And they use the examples of modern day speculation, land rushes, feudalism, the political relations between lord and king, king and pauper, and that, they've seen this cycle of oppression and recoding of groups time in and time out.
Well, I think you touched on something very important there, because some people will say, they'll read all this or they'll listen to us describe it, and they say, sure, but like, what is the end of this? So like, what do they lean to? If it is total anarchy that they desire, how does that differ from Haiti? And they don't really know. And we just kind of explained there that it all comes down to coded flows. To them, there isn't really a difference between a moral and a taboo. And that's where you can begin to detect the socio-political game that they're playing here. Like, it's all just fucking codes. We got to get rid of all of it, is what they're saying, because it's all fascism. Anything that's good or bad should be treated equally. Because who was it? I think it was, and this is probably what will help us lead into the next part, which is defining what we mean by Oedipus. But he had asked, where he had made a comment like, what is it about Oedipus that relates to this? Do they see Oedipus as the ideal? And I said, well, not really. So, and this is how it would kind of launch into this and summarize, and you tell me if I'm way off on this. It's, when you think of Oedipus, the character of Oedipus, well, what do we know about him? Cliff Notes version, it's that a man who killed his father to sleep with his mother, right? That's the ultimate taboo. And Freud was famous for stating or implying that everyone has an edible complex. Everyone, and you'll hear people say this still. They'll say, "Oh, everyone wants to fuck their mother and their father, whatever," and that's not true. Most of psychoanalysis has backed off from that. However, it was taken seriously for quite some time, just based off of this character. And what they were saying wasn't that, and this is what I kind of like about this book. This is what can fool people into thinking it's really exciting. It's that the book is attempting to hold psychiatry and Freud to account by saying, no, it is not the case that everyone wants to fuck their parents. However, that need arises, or that desire arises, mainly because there is a rule against it, which sounds counterintuitive. But we, on the, let's say, political right where we think that systems are there to assess and address criminality or degeneracy, whatever you want to call it, They take almost the inverted perspective, which is that no, these systems create degeneracy. You only get this Oedipal drive because there's a taboo against it, because there's oppression. And in our world, and this is, they don't say this explicitly, but this is what I get from reading it. They're saying that because the question is always in a completely true anarchistic society with no rules, do what thou wilt, what do you do about criminals? They're kind of saying that that just wouldn't exist. Not that we would tolerate criminality, but if we removed all these systems, criminality would disappear as well, because criminality and degeneracy only exists in the shadow of the rules we create. So they're a symptom of the system, which is a completely inverted way of looking at it. And so that's kind of how we approach Oedipus, as this example of like a drive that's created from like these coded flows. Would that be an accurate way of saying it in your view?
Yeah, they really don't take any sort of. They look at this purely from a lens of anti-fascism. There's not as much of a racial or a human biodiversity lens into this at all. Because if you actually were to keep going through this chapter, they'll reference, of course, Wilhelm Reich and Jean-Paul Sartre, where they say, well, really, group spontaneity exists, and you can't really do much about that because, you're still distinguishing yourself in terms of class or in some other form of bonds against the state or against another or the other. And of course, those are unconscious group desires, which we would take for granted as in, well, I have an in-group preference because that's just natural and biological. I don't trust the outsider that looks like he wants to kill me. And in fact, they go down there later about that, where they say, well, actually, our internal desires can't be deceived. Our interests can be. But when they're talking about fascism, and they keep trying to ask and answer the question, well, why do people seek fascism? Or, to answer Wilhelm Reich's question, why did we vote for fascism to begin with? And so, what do they mean by traditional bonds and things like that? For Deleuze and Guattari, they think that this all goes back to the concept of the state and nothing more and nothing less. They don't think of anything transcendent. They don't think of anything eternal. And they really don't think that the idea of blood and soil is actually real in terms of like a biological aspect, that we have in-group preferences. They think that these bonds are parts of a historical process, which brings us to the functions of the state. And so that they would say that, our idea of civilization or Western civilization are merely processes of being decoded, deterritorialized, and then reterritorialized with these institutions that have archaic and barbarous implications, such as, violence, criminality, punishing the sick, and all the things that we would see traditional leftists call these anachronistic, ugly forms of society that's just forms of oppression. And this is where, if you wanted to be a James Lindsay type, you would be like, there it is. There's my oppressor-oppressed narrative, but it goes much further than that.
Yeah, someone like James Lindsay does not have the personality or mind to apprehend any of these ideas because he's looking for buzzwords. And I remember I just released Real Secret Coffee Hours episode. You might like it because I get furious.
I listened to it when I was at work.
Yeah, just at the end, like you don't have the mind for academia. Even you don't have any intellectual curiosity. You hear a word and you do a gotcha, and then, but like, what is your project? What do you want to do? Because you can't just. Your desire can't just be to poke holes in things, right? But yeah, like a James Lindsay would maybe get to page 5 of this and say, yeah, this sounds like Marx, and Marx is basically a moron. So, read Milton Friedman. Have you tried Friedman? I wonder if he's ever commented on Milton Friedman, actually. Now, getting into Oedipus here. So let me just check the chat right here. Oh, we got King Salmonfish stirring it up again. I just want to call attention to the book club, one of my personal favorite channels. The bind for them is that rejection of capitalism by D&G threatened to reinstate the fascist overcoding voice. Now, here's a guy who talks our language. Here's a guy who's done the reading. The book club. I steal some of my best books from the book club. If you want to know the shit I'm going to act out of pocket on in 3 weeks, check out the book club. A lot of people saying they should send people to Somalia. What else we got here? Oh, I mean, people just being lewd here. Big Ben saying the cum must flow. You talk about flows, this is what you get. I guess it's, when they predicted this.
It's only fair. It's only fair because we talked about the solar anus in the first episode. It's only fair.
Yeah. Well, I mean, really, like, you can't talk about this book without getting a little lewd. I mean, yeah, by the page 20, you've seen anus like 10 times.
So true.
I wanted to just call attention to Hazel's before capitalism, we called schizos seers, and that is predicting where we're going to get to next. I just wanted to read this part here. Getting into Oedipus, getting into what you touched on just briefly before about the family dynamic, which really sits at the heart of what they're trying to deconstruct. Because like those on the right, they would say that the family is the core, the nucleus of a lot of these systems. So much of this book is affirming what a lot of trad guys would say, but saying like, yes, but it's bad actually. So Oedipus restrained is the figure of the daddy, mommy, me triangle, the familial constellation in person. But when psychoanalysis makes of Oedipus its dogma, it is not aware of the existence of relations said to be pre-Oedipal in the child, ex-Oedipal in the psychotic, para-Oedipal in others. The function of Oedipus as dogma, or as the nuclear complex, is inseparable from a forcing by which the psychoanalysis as theoretician elevates himself to the conception of the generalized Oedipus. Now, there's an interesting idea that he gets to and develops a bit more here, that these two see, the authors see Oedipus as reaffirmed in psychiatry. So they're trying to dismantle the entire psychiatric process by saying, like, look, by you trying to psychoanalyze people, you are justifying the Oedipal model by saying that everything comes back to the family. The family is so important, and the relationship between me and you is kind of Oedipal, that you reaffirm the power and relevance of Oedipus, and your job as a psychoanalysis should be to deconstruct all of that. But there's this idea that you get in a lot of leftist literature. I think it was Luis Althusser. He was talking about the idea of a superstructure, and there's this idea that you keep seeing time and time again, that the system or the superstructure only exists to perpetuate itself, so that any system within that larger system that is permitted to exist must only exist to serve the larger system, that the system would never permit anything inside of it that would be a threat to itself, even something that would seem to counteract the system or be in opposition to the system. It must in some way further the existence of that system. So there's this idea that they're taking that notion and just blowing it out, which is like, well, then everything must be Oedipus, even when trying to break it down, or by acknowledging that there's some kind of Oedipal desire, you're only strengthening it. And the only solution to this system is complete deconstruction at every single level. And he goes on here. I don't know. I got a note here, but without a page number, but I'm just going to read it. It says, it would seem obvious that parents indeed make their appearance on the recording surface of desiring production. But this is, in fact, the crux of the entire Oedipal problem. What are the precise forces that cause the Oedipal triangulation to close up, or rather become a complete system? The child is a metaphysical being. As in the case of the Cartesian cognito, parents have nothing to do with these questions. And we are guilty of an error when we confuse the fact that this question is related to the parents in the sense of being recounted or communicated to them, with the notion that is related to them in the sense of fundamental connection to them. For the unconscious is an orphan and produces itself within the identity of nature and man. So there's this idea that a child is as close as you can get to a pure set of desiring machines of uninterrupted flows, and the parents sort of bear down on it. And so the parents relationship, the daddy, mommy, me triangle, as he calls it, is the first step you get to segmenting reality. Like, I'm here, I'm a child, I'm at one with the universe, but then daddy's over here, mommy's over there, and they have a relationship. So there's this sort of duality there. Where do I fit into this duality? Boom, there you go. Now you are within this, you've given birth to the idea of systems, and you're sort of Cartesian approximation in a larger set of systems. So, you would have to imagine that in their, let's call it, ideal outlook, there wouldn't be parents. There would just be this flow of individuals. And we'll get into actually what that looks like later. But just to say that the birth of the Oedipal desire is the mom and dad themselves. Does that sound right?
Yeah, and this also goes back to what we were talking about in the first episode in relation to the infamous body without organs conversation. Because when you look at, the sort of, I almost, I guess, at the nuclear level, to sort of borrow off the language of family, is that this is sort of the agent in which inscribes onto the child the desire to produce and for flows of information and society to go to there. That's where social production begins, is at the family. And so when you are reading through, especially on the chapter on psychoanalysis and familialism, that for them, the body without organs is a genealogical network that isn't familial. They're only partial objects. They're only one thing that's sort of at the side. They're not these explicit relationships that is mom and that is dad, and that there is a paterfamilias there, and that there is this head of the household. There's no social repression. There's just this sort of precocious network that I'm related to, but I'm not related to. And in fact, we must steal and get rid of and confiscate the Newman, or, as they describe it, they're like, see, God is daddy. This desiring experience has to be done away with. And so instead, our lack and our desire to produce is now in a network that is not as linear and it is not as hierarchical in that structure.
Yeah, as you were saying that, very annoying quote jumped into my mind. Made me think of the Joker. And it made me think of that scene in The Dark Knight where the Joker is confronting Harvey Two-Face. He says, "Don't sound like a man with a plan. I just do things." And your description there of like the introduction of the lack into the system of desiring machines. It's like believing that I need something that I don't have. That's in itself a corruption. In the perfect world of natural chaotic desiring machines, you would say, yeah, you just want things, and then you're at the level of nature. Like, does a plant want to photosynthesize photons? Not really. It doesn't desire to do it, just does things. So that's how I try and get my mind around like what they want us to be like. And I just wanted to say this, where I'm looking at page 79 in my PDF, just to restate what he said here. Yet every psychoanalysis should know that underneath Oedipus, through Oedipus, behind Oedipus, his business is with desiring machines. At the beginning, psychoanalysis could not be unaware of the forcing employed to introduce Oedipus, to inject it into the unconscious. Then Oedipus fell back on and appropriated desiring production, as if all the productive forces emanated from Oedipus itself. The psychoanalysis became the carrier of Oedipus, the great agent of anti-production and desire. And here we return to this idea introduced in the first one. And there's a lot of different ways to interpret this. The funniest thing about the first episode was, we made a comment early on that, you read a definition of body without organs and you get 5 different people saying 5 different things. And even in this episode, you and I had like slightly different explanations of what it was. And then I remember just one comment from the chat, I'm like, it's pretty fucking clear what he means by body without organs. And he gave just a completely different outline, just none of it fit together.
Remember, we had put it on screen last episode that even the wiki page in English is like, it's a fuzzy concept.
Yeah. But I think we got it. But then there's this, the phrase fall back upon. Now, the way I maybe literally imagine that was, he says here, Oedipus fall back on and appropriate desire and production. So it's like something emerges from it and falls back on, as if draping it, as if to say, I own this now. So that's a theme that they keep establishing throughout the book. Like something emerges and then rewrites it as if it was that the entire time. So he's very explicitly taking on psychoanalysis here by saying, no, you are the originators of the Oedipal problem in society today. And this is something I'd mentioned even on Vanguard's journal, that it's almost impossible, whether we like it or not, that all of us here, even those of us who are hip to this shit, we can't not live in a psychiatric context. We psychoanalyze ourselves and each other all the fucking time. We love calling people insane. We like calling them. How many times have you called someone a narcissist this week or this month? We tend to use psychoanalytic terms. We're so bound up in it. And I feel like that's what he's saying here, where it's like, it's you people who've injected this obsession with Oedipal systems in all of society, and to the point where these systems have like rewritten history into that's all it's ever been. And so despite all that, they can't explain anything without being firmly locked within that psychoanalytic context. Because like as you're reading the book, you don't get the sense that they're that concerned with science. They're not that concerned with history, really. There's not a lot of dates in here. There's not a lot of sources like that. It's very fast and loose with that. So they they seem to employ harder sciences in a very fuzzy, fluid, in like an interrogation of them, like a psychoanalyst would, which is and I would say that's the basis of all leftist thought. Period. Point blank fucking period. From the Lacan right to Zizek to anyone who's on the left right now, the basis of their entire political project is some form of psychoanalysis. They don't seem to have any concern with any other history. Like political theory is just something they've scaffolded psychoanalysis with.
Yeah, and I think that it's also an important thing to consider when they're talking about how these things get encoded. And I think that how you had described it is that we see these flows or these forms of information get instantly recoded at birth from the family, and we think that that's the way it's always been. That's the form of Oedipal representation. And Deleuze and Guattari talk about this when they're referring to, say, like sexual expression or forms of symbolism, whether that be phallic symbolism, symbolism that is not repressed, and that primitives, they always repress this representation, but they keep the affectation all still present within themselves, and they notice that this is a form of just like patriarchal forms of order and systems. For them, again, taking psychoanalysis and sort of the Freudian and the Lacanian sense of that, world and that sort of gestalt head on, they say that, we repress this representation. We have to, keep the sexuality in a certain place because that is sort of the Oedipal representation. It is the object of repression because things like incest are prohibited. We always, and it goes back to falling back, that fall back upon rationale. It's desired because it's prohibited, and they think that that's really not perhaps the correct way to look upon this. It's claimed to be prohibited because it's been encoded since the beginning, and they form that out and saying that these prohibitions is just one type of sexual relations that are blocked paths. So this repression is not born of the traditional understanding of the Oedipal complex in psychoanalysis, but rather instead it is what they call a social psychic repression system that gives rise to it. And they think that this is part of order, this is the part of that representation, that this sexual repression is part in which we see in all societies, more or less, in a way in which order is confounded. And they don't ever consider instinct here. They don't consider that maybe screwing someone that's that close to you genetically might have some problems. Because even as they point out, looking at certain tribes and elsewhere, that these things don't actually exist, even in the most isolated, least developed parts of the world. And again, that's where they're like, maybe, psychoanalysis here can't answer questions in which we see outside of nature.
It's so funny that they would probably look at the tribe on North Sentinel Island, people who know that, just the tribe of uncontacted people who are hostile to the outside world. They would probably look at them and see them as, traumatized by capitalism. You know what I mean? Like there's nothing on this earth that has escaped the, neurosis of capitalism. You can't find an example of it anywhere right now. I wanted to just call attention to one comment we have here. Oh, actually, a couple of comments by Fabian Cartouche. He wrote
He's a channel member. Greatly appreciate his contributions.
Because this is going to lead into the next one. This is just his third comment. It says the most common mistake among the contemporary parents is to ascribe desiringness to infantile behavior in unwitting acquiescence in a relatively novel consumer ethical framework. I just wanted to lead into this next part with that because we kind of round up the familial thing right here. I'm on page, I think I have it on the screen there. Yeah. It says, go back through the course of the ages. You will never find a child caught in a familial order that is autonomous, expressive, or signifying. Even the nursing child in his games and in his feelings, his chains and his meditations is already caught up in an immediate desiring production where the parents play the role of partial objects, witnesses, reporters, and agents. It is true that nothing is pre-Oedipal, and that we must take Oedipus back to the earliest age, but within the order of a repression of the unconscious. We are now able to surmise what Oedipus signifies. It displaces the limit, it internalizes the limit. Rather a society of neurotics than one successful schizophrenic who has not been made autistic. And that might be the line of the episode. I can see that some people let rather a society of neurotics than one successful schizophrenic who has not been made autistic. That's the literally me for some of these guys. Oedipus, the incompatible instrument of gregariousness, is the ultimate private and subjugated territoriality of European man. And I found that interesting that he used European man so distinctly there, because you don't see much of a concern for race or ethnicity elsewhere there. I think maybe they're admitting that they can only really understand, the European point of view in this, but it does make you wonder, because they are leftists, if they see the European man as uniquely bad or uniquely autistic and neurotic.
Well, and it's also a way to slyly approach and attack this from the lens of confronting psychoanalysis. Because before you even get into the chapter on psychoanalysis, it's that they desire to complete the task, like to this Oedipal complex. They have to explain it. Oedipus is the modern tyrant, has benefited very little from being disinfected from its the world of psychoanalysis. So instead, we have to look at the parental complex. We have to look at encoding from parental structure. And so that's what they say is that, quote, hence, instead of participating in an undertaking that will bring about genuine liberation, psychoanalysis is taking part in the work of bourgeois repression at its most far-reaching level. That is to say, keeping European humanity harnessed to the yoke of daddy mommy and making no effort to do away with this problem once and for all. And so they see even this form of psychoanalysis, which a lot of guys on the right would be like, how could you, hate psychoanalysis from the left? And it's like, oh boy, these guys are going to tell you.
Yeah, because it's not deconstructive enough is their idea, which to me, at least I respect that. I respect, because, for the same reason I would respect someone like Pentti Linkola, the deep ecologist and eco-fascist, as the only reputable and serious environmentalist. Because if you're seriously an environmentalist, you have to think about it all the way to the bottom and be extreme to the point where you want to break all the airplanes with hammers and go back to sort of a Tyler Durden, agrarian society, and also reduce the population by about 5 billion people worldwide. But that, if you're serious about it and if you're really into nature and trees and shit, that's as far as you got to go. Similarly, if you take Marxism seriously, like these guys do, and you thought about it all the way to the bottom, it's like, well, yeah, you need to destroy everything. And if you are a psychoanalyst, your job needs to be deconstructing on a very, very granular psychological level, everything. And if you're not doing that, then you're not a leftist. And, like when I read this, I say, well, that's what you would do if you were taking these ideas seriously. So if you don't believe this, well, I guess you're not a leftist. You're some kind of you're just like a liberal who hates their landlord, right? But at least this is crazy enough to be, serious about what they say. Oh, Vulbus Persona says fight farm. I just want to call attention to that.
Yeah, I mean, in my copy of the text, European is mentioned 5 specific times, and it is all within the discussion about civilization and as well as repression with respects to the Oedipal complex. So, for instance, when they talk about religion specifically, they talk about the imminent forces about capitalism, specifically the way in which we talk about debt. They refer to this, of course, through this describes the evolution of infinite death through Catholicism, then the Reformation, the extreme spiritualization of the despotic state, the extreme internalization of the capitalist field. Define bad conscience. The latter is not cynicism's contrary. It is, in private reasons, the correlate to cynicism of social persons. All the cynical tactics of bad conscience, just as Nietzsche and Lawrence and Miller analyzed them to arrive at the definition of civilized European man, the hypnosis and the rain of images, the torpor they spread, the hatred of life and all that is free, all that passes and flows, the universal effusion of death, of the death instinct, depression and guilt used as a mean of contagion, the kiss of the vampire. Aren't you ashamed to be happy? So attacking the force of the church, and even then its Protestant descendants.
It was funny that there's several times, because once you get to the middle of this book, there's a lot. It kind of restates its central points that we're trying to give people right now, but it almost twists itself up, where like it'll start talking about the Catholic Church. And you think you know where it's going. It's like, okay, the Catholic Church is the worst offender of this. It's like, no, actually, it's the Protestants. They're like, oh, okay. Like it's trying to do these like plot twists within itself just to slip you up. Like you think you know where we're going, but we got some. It's deeper than you think. It's more confusing and convoluted than you think. And then at a certain point, you're like, oh, you're just fucking with me now. You're just trying to you're making this. You're digging this deeper to just add depth. I think we had discussed this a while ago and discussing the book, that it kind of starts repeating itself midway through. A lot of the best stuff, in my opinions, in the beginning, but it's almost like a novelty midway through. Would you say that's true?
To some extent, I think that it does really expand itself out, where you really see this as a critique. And I think if you're going to look at this from maybe a rightist perspective, where this is really attacking European man, like this is attacking sort of what we would probably just call like the white Western world. And it's sort of attacking, psychoanalysis by saying like, no, this doesn't do a good enough job at deconstructing sort of the symbolic and imaginary structures in which information in our conscience flows. But instead, they go even further. They say, well, actually, no, that this sort of resentment is only going to go against ourselves, and this projection now attacks the other, which reinforces civilization, which reinforces oppression. And they say things like, oh, well, the father's dead, it's my fault. Well, who killed him? Well, actually, it's your fault. It's the Jews, it's the Arabs, it's the Chinese, all the resources of racism and segregation, the abject desire to be loved, the whimpering not at being loved enough and not being understood, concurrent with the whole reduction of sexuality to the dirty little secret. He says the priest's psychology, there's not a single one of these tactics does not find Oedipus in its land of milk and honey, its good provider, nor is there a single one of these tactics that it does not serve to develop in psychoanalysis, the latter being the development in the avatar of the ascetic, as in ascesis, as in fasting, that ideal. And again, this is their criticism of psychoanalysis. And in fact, we actually need something different. We need schizoanalysis, and we need to look at what does it mean to be a schizophrenic in a world of constant reterritorialization and encoding of oppression and structure. And instead, we have to find a way to free ourselves from a world of capital and a world of schizoanalysis, and instead, or of psychoanalysis, and instead embrace a new medium of looking at the world, which is the schizophrenic. You there, Dimes?
I was on mute again. There we go. Sorry.
There you go.
Yes, that's as good a place as any to launch into the next part. But there is one like chunk of text I wanted to read just because it sounds pretty wild, and I want people to see it, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, go for it.
This is sort of in between Oedipus and schizoanalysis. I'm just going to read it. It says, one then claims to make history with these two entities, these two puppets, the great crustacean and the crazy invertebrate. Oedipus is placed at the beginning. On the one side, there's the great man, defined Oedipally. So he killed his father in a murder without end, either to annihilate him and identify with the mother, or to internalize him, to take his place, to reach a reconciliation. In any case, the great man is already great because, for good or for evil, he has found a certain original solution to the Oedipal conflict. Hitler annihilates the father and unleashes in him the forces of the bad mother. Luther internalizes the father and reaches a compromise with the superego. On second order, this time collective, the encounter can therefore take place between Luther, the 16th century Christians, or between Hitler and the German people, with corresponding elements that do not necessarily imply identity. Hitler plays the role of the father through homosexual transfusion and in relation to the female crowd. Luther plays the role of woman in relation to God of the Christians. Oedipus depends on this sort of nationalistic, religious, racist sentiment, and not the reverse. It is not the father who's projected onto the boss, but the boss who is applied to the father, either in order to tell us you will not surpass your father or you will surpass him to find our forefathers. Jacques Lacan, has demonstrated in a profound way the link between Oedipus and segregation. Now, I really just wanted to read that to talk about, what was it? Hitler plays the role of father through homosexual transfusion. That's one of those refuses to elaborate and leaves type of comment. I don't remember them kind of explaining what that is, but I just think I know it now. Everyone else should know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's sort of, and I can't help but think of Jordan Peterson, and I feel so awful for saying that. But at the same time, you mentioned crustaceans. I guess I'm going to make the assumption or make that connection. But I mean, yeah, it is something that they just don't go any further on at all. They don't like explain on these things at all. So they just they're like, well, on one hand, you have to take a look at it. So he killed the father, murder without end, didn't do annihilate him, da 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 da. And it's just like, can't you see how this process has been continued on from ages to ages? Can't you see how this is always going to happen unless we break free? This is why Wilhelm Reich is asking that question. Why did people vote for fascism? Because they want the father figure that will actually be the Oedipal figure that will kill the other. And that's sort of their attempt at answering the question, why did people want, fascism? Or why do people vote for Donald Trump? Why do people not want illegals in their country or want eggs and gas to be cheaper? Well, for them, it's this like really sick carnal desire to like kill your dad. Da, da, da. And it's just like, no, it's way more simple than that. But thank you for telling me how I'm awful and oppressed.
Well, and what's interesting is, I know you've mentioned lack a couple of times, but I don't think they outright say this in the book, but it would seem that at the heart of the problem is this entire idea of love. The entire idea of love would be the source of all man's troubles, because what is the desire to love and to be loved and to reproduce as an innate human drive is like the ultimate corruption, because seeking out love is like the ultimate lack, or feeling lonely is the ultimate lack. And so like the idea, like some people would say in a truly anarchistic society, you have to learn how to love other people. But I think it's important to establish that in this ideal world, there is no such thing as love, really. And I think that's a good way to launch into schizoanalysis, because to explain what schizoanalysis is, and that's a word you hear a lot. I've heard people just use that, just tossing it out. It's a good word to use, schizoanalysis. Some people use it just to mean a crazy way of looking at something, or just a heterodox way.
Ironically, schizoanalysis is more clearly defined in this text than a good chunk of really what you're going to find in all 200 plus pages of this work. And I mean, and it's really funny because, well, not funny, but I mean, it's just an interesting observation to me that they'll take, again, when sort of like the left and the right will take a different approach and they'll just run in a completely different direction with the same concept. Well, I mean, we do this with postmodernism. That's why we're also covering this text. But, for instance, Deleuze and Guattari, they cite Nietzsche quite a bit. And, they take it in a way where they're like, well, what if we took, Nietzsche's concept even further and identify the slave morality and the talk about power and where we like want to be in terms of our relationship to power, which they would just call fascism. But, when they talk about like savages, barbarians, civilized men, what do we mean by that? Well, they're referring, of course, to the discussion about, the Oedipal complex, guilt, and how that's been the structure of our society. So, for instance, Nietzsche writes this in Genealogy of Morals that, he's about the development of infinite debt in which, the slaves have been freed, in which the slave can rule. Deleuze and Guattari note in their notes here, it's just like, Historians of religions and psychoanalysts are very familiar with the problem of the masculinization of the imperial triad in terms of the father-son relationship being brought into it. Nietzsche sees this as a problem and as an essential moment in the development of the infinite debt. Quoting from the Genealogy of Morals, that stroke of genius on the part of Christianity, God himself sacrifices himself for the guilt of mankind. God himself makes payment to himself. God is the only being who can redeem man from what has become unredeemable for man himself. The creditor sacrifices himself for his debtor. Out of love. Can one credit that? Out of love for his debtor. That's the.
By the way, if you want to give the page number, you were
That would be page 217. And it's just a small little footnote. But this is the point in which they're saying basically psychoanalysis doesn't go far enough. Which, again, the repeating of itself, but this time you're looking distinctly at Western religiosity.
No, and I think, I didn't even really latch on to the whole European civilization part of this the first time reading it, but it's just sort of like a little clue as to where they're going with this. Now, what's interesting is that when I was compiling the notes for this, and maybe you're the same, I had to create sort of a flow of ideas that were jumping around the entire book. So in explaining schizoanalysis, I got notes it starts with a note from page 162 and then goes back to page 30 and then to page 46, just to like explain this in any coherent manner, because it really does jump around a lot. So I was just going to read a part here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let's see. Let's go back to page 30 here. We've already talked previously about the difference between, a literate society and an oral society, and when they go back in time or cast themselves back in time, the different sorts of flows you would get in an ancient civilization. So there was a part I was going to read. We don't need to go into that, so I'll just read this. It says, the schizophrenic is the universal producer. There is no need to distinguish between producing and its product. We need merely note that the pure thisness of the object produced is carried over into a new act of producing. This rule of continually producing production, of grafting producing onto the product, is a characteristic of desiring machines or primary production, the production of production itself. And he mentions Judge Schreiber, which we talked about before. This is, for people to catch the first one, the case of a judge who wrote of his own descent into schizophrenia, which was used as a primary source for a lot of Freud's work and is also held very highly by Deleuze and Guattari. Judge Schreiber lived for a long time without a stomach, without intestines, almost without lungs, with a torn esophagus, without a bladder, with shattered ribs. He used to sometimes swallow part of his larynx with his food, etc. The body without organs is non-productive. Nonetheless, it is produced at a certain place at a certain time in a connective synthesis as the identity producing the product. So when we talk about schizoanalysis and schizophrenia, I think it's important to start by saying this is literally schizophrenia. It's not just a term they're borrowing to mean something else. They look at the schizophrenic, the same schizophrenic you're probably thinking of, as the perfected way to counteract Oedipus. So, and I guess we could just start by discussing this. To me, the way they describe the schizophrenic, they described it just there as a sort of thisness, a nowness, living in the moment. There's just living completely unseparated from the world. You're open to all information. You are decoding information and internalizing, but you're not even memorizing. You're not taking information and building it into like a superstructure yourself. Everything we would say that would make a schizophrenic at odds with society makes them the perfect vehicle for this sort of model, this sort of project of theirs. And that is what we should endeavor to become. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and on top of that, it's also this understanding that when one is in a world of, let me word this correctly, we have to understand where these causes of control come from, these systems of control. And in fact, we not only have to, look and go down this path, but we also have to understand that these forms of behavior and this encoding gives us the causal grounding for fascism, this lacking that we want to produce to make up the whole for, whether that be in religion, whether that be in capitalism. And instead, we have to uproot ourselves from cause and tradition and instead look towards the opposite path. Perhaps things are the inverse. Perhaps they're the, and hence the title of the book, the Anti-Oedipus, the anti-Oedipal drive. What if the world wasn't encoded the way in that it is? And instead, we must be looking towards the intangible, the immaterial, the things that are not necessarily grounded and encoded in a way that would force us to explain things in the traditional causal logic assignment meaning way of understanding the world around us, which again is the basis for the Western understanding of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why it's more of a toolkit than a utopian vision of it. And there's another part here that I love that really outwardly states what they're talking about, page 38 on my side. It can be said that the schizophrenic passes from one code to the other, that he deliberately scrambles all the codes by quickly shifting from one to the other according to the questions asked him, never giving the same explanation from one day to the next, never invoking the same genealogy, never recording the same event in the same way. When he is more or less forced into it and not in a touchy mood, he may even accept the banal Oedipal code so long as he can stuff it full of all the disjunctions that the code was designed to eliminate. If you've ever had the pleasure of speaking to someone who has schizophrenia, I've done that a couple of times in the past. Sometimes it can be very jarring, but especially for the more eloquent ones, and not the ones that are overcome by paranoia, because it's, you can be a paranoid schizophrenic where you start believing that your upstairs neighbor is tapping a message down to you. But if you can ever engage with a schizophrenic, you will see you feed them information, and you can see in real time how they build a very cogent response, but otherwise incoherent. Like they'll use your words, and you'll watch them kind of rework it in their minds, and it has no relation to what they just said, but there's like a purity of the moment. But it's not like they're blubbering idiots. They can take care of themselves. They could even defend themselves if necessary, but it's just this other thing. And this is where the psychoanalysis comes in, because I think they looked at just a schizophrenic and said, this could be society. Like I was always laughing at futurists, where I read the Futurist Manifesto by Marinetti many years ago, and the entire manifesto, which is fairly short, was built upon him riding in a really fast train one day and describing how cool it felt to go fast on a really fast train. And just me laughing, him looking at the window going, is this politics? So that looking at like a babbling schizophrenic, like, yeah, this is sex. This is everything, right? But, and trying to build the schizophrenic into something that I really just don't think it is. And maybe that's not being charitable enough to the ideas, but sometimes when you talk to schizophrenics, you don't get the sense that they're just pure enlightened individuals. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they look like you see a lot of pain in their eyes. Sometimes you look at they're not just these star children descended to interpret society in a sensible way. Sometimes it just sucks being schizophrenic. Now, what do you think about that? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, on one hand, you certainly see that for them, the schizophrenic is more than perhaps what society would assign it to, which is why I think they go straight for that definition, or straight for that sort of title. Is that we have to understand that paranoia, being schizophrenic, these are determinate conditions. These are assigned things from society. And in fact, that we have to embrace them. We have to look at them more. And like you said, that we have this schizophrenic German judge at the beginning, which sort of becomes the model. We can use his experience to look around the world, and we can bypass Jung, we can bypass molecular biology, and instead we're going to try and understand the world in a way that is not just based around the world and the terms around it, which again, reality kind of kicks in. You're like, well, I don't know how far you can really run with this. I think this is where you kind of run into the problem we had with like the mapping of metaphor with like the spine and history. But I think at least with respects to this and what Deleuze and Guattari are doing and what they expand upon in 1,000 Plateaus is that they at least can bypass and provide a deeper meaning than just a one-off metaphor, because they'll go much deeper and they'll try and respond and counter to what they would call Freudianism. In fact, we have to liquidate that. We have to look towards a much different model, a schizoparanoic mode of reasoning.
You know, Prude, I'm once again reminded of the Joker. But there's this idea that one of the writers had a long time ago in one of the graphic novels that it was like one of the Arkham profiles, and it said, the Joker exhibits not insanity but form of supersanity, where he reinvents himself every day. And this was a really clever way, I thought, for the writers to write themselves around the fact that the Joker as a character changes over the years. Like in the past, he's kind of like a merry prankster, and then he becomes just a rapist serial killer later. So it's a way for them to say, oh, that's all the same Joker. And he's just not insane, but he kind of reinvents himself to a very chaotic world. And it's a commentary on the world. Yeah. But that's kind of what this is here, that the schizophrenic, because they do think that more people should be schizophrenic. But it's interesting that it says, they say early on, and we said it on the beginning of the stream, that this society produces schizophrenics like it produces any other product. And I'm not sure that even makes sense. Like, because in the true state of humanity, we would all be schizophrenic anyway, in a sense. We would have like that seems to be the truer state of man. So, but to say that this society in its fallen state produces more schizophrenics, I'm not even sure that logically tracks. Like, what do you think about that? Or am I just reading this wrong?
I think you have to view it very specifically within the confines of what they're defining themselves against. So, for instance, if you were to go to page 314 in my book, I don't know what it is in yours. It's in the chapter about psychoanalysis and capitalism, which is the introduction to schizoanalysis chapter. And I think that it's pretty important to sort of look at what they consider it to be, which in this case is going to be specifically from the, they say, oh, psychoanalysis is from the couch, and this is when things really kind of kick in. And it's that schizoanalysis is the opposite of this. So in fact, they say, quote, there are only resistances, then machines, desiring machines. Oedipus is a resistance. If we have been able to speak on the intrinsically perverted nature of psychoanalysis, this is due to the fact that perversion in general is the artificial reterritorialization of the flows of desire, whose machines, on the contrary, are indices of deterritorialized production. The psychoanalyst reterritorializes on the couch, and the representation of Oedipus in castration. Schizoanalysis, on the contrary, must disengage the deterritorialized flows of desire, then the molecular elements laid down by Leclerc. Molecular elements of desiring production. We should again call to mind the practical rule laid down by Leclerc following Lacan, the rule of the right to nonsense, as well as to the absence of a link. You will not have reached the ultimate and irreducible terms of the unconscious so long as you find or restore a link between two elements. But how then can one see this in the extreme dispersion, machines dispersed in every machine, nothing more than pure fiction that must give away to reality as defined by lack, with Oedipus and castration back at the gallop, and at the same time one reduces the absence of a link to a signifier of absence, charged with representing the absence, linking this with absence itself, and with us moving back and forth from one pole of displacement to another. One falls back into the molder hole while claiming to unmask the real. What complicates everything is that there is this indeed a necessity for desiring production to be induced from representation, to be discovered through lines of escape. But this is true in a way altogether different from what psychoanalysis believes it to be. The decoded flows of desire form the free energy, libido, of desiring machines. The desiring machine takes form and trains their sights on a tangent of deterritorialization that traverses along the representative spheres, that runs along the body without organs, leaving, escaping, but while causing more escapes. The desiring machines themselves are the flow schizzes, or the break flows that break the flow and at the same time on the body without organs, not the gaping wound represented in castration and psychoanalysis, but the myriad of little connections, disjunctions, and conjunctions by which every machine produces a flow in relation to one another that breaks it, and breaks a flow that another produces. And to break that down, what we're getting at here is that Deleuze and Guattari are saying that instead it must be destructive. We must look at the fact that schizoanalysis, capitalism, fascism, forms of oppression, all things that are brought onto us from parents to the intrinsic desire for us to seek the comfort of like-minded beings and souls. All of this and says we in fact shouldn't have to care about these connections. Why should we care about your grandmother? Why should we care about what the foreman wants you to do on company time? Instead, we must be creating a system that deterritorializes ourselves from these very specific conditions which assign meaning. And once meaning is assigned, you are now a decoded, reterritorialized being to serve, and that your desire for production is based off the Oedipal complex, and we must reject that. And instead, we must be going down to break down all things with respect to representation. We must find off territoriality that allows us to embrace what we once were, that is no longer encoded. And this is why the body without organs gets described rhizomatically, because much like in the way that a mushroom will grow its mycelium and tendrils out into the ground and the things that are dead, building off these dead encodings, things are now reterritorialized to break down further bonds. This is why you see it in what I was just reading, leaving, escaping, but while causing more escapes. These are the things that break the flow of information, that are broken from the encoding of capitalist society, and we are no longer laying down on the psychoanalyst's chair, but we are instead disembodied, de-individuated, and are no longer caring about what they think is the assignment for how the world should operate.
I just wanted to call attention to a comment here from Vingul. Guys, I'm having a bad night, so I'm thinking it's over. R.I.P. Western civilization. And the antidote to that, in my view, was what Prudentialist just read. Anytime you're feeling down and out about things being over or happening, go ahead and read some of this shit. Go ahead and read what your opponents want to do to the world or think ought to be done. It's easy to get twisted up in our own, plans or projections on what's going to happen. But believe me, there's people out there that really, really believe in this stuff, that believe like everything you represent needs to be annihilated at a molecular level, and they think it's cool, and they do it in the horniest way possible. They can't do it without talking about dicks and butts the whole time too. That's what you're fighting against, people. Here comes Mike D. What is he? Oh no, he's talking about someone else, I think. I thought, what are we reading? You don't want to know, brother. Just to keep on the path of schizophrenia, I wanted to, because he makes mention of schizophrenia plus autism plus neuroticism. I'm looking at page 46 here. The theory of schizophrenia is formulated in terms of three concepts that constitute its trinary schema. So this is what schizophrenia is. So probably should have opened with this, but disassociation, autism, and space-time or being in the world. That's that idea we keep coming back to. The ego, however, is like daddy mommy. The schizo has long since ceased to believe in it. He is somewhere else, beyond or behind or below these problems, rather than immersed in them. There are those who will maintain that the schizo is incapable of uttering the word I, and that we must restore his ability to pronounce this hallowed word. And that's kind of what you were getting at with the that previous part about the role of the psychoanalyst is to impose the Oedipal model on the schizophrenia. I think this was you really addressing my first question, which was, how is it that this corrupted society, this fallen state, can produce more schizophrenics than previously in history? And let's just say that it is. The role of psychiatry is to imprison those schizophrenics, which is to say that I think the argument he's making is that there would be more schizophrenics now if not for psychiatry and psychoanalysis. There would be more people naturally employing schizoanalysis if we weren't psychoanalyzing ourselves all the time. And maybe there's something to that. That's an interesting idea. I don't hate that idea. That if we remove this tendency, even on our side, to psychoanalyze ourselves, everyone would be talking like they write a fucking Substack. And just continue on here. All of which the schizo sums up by saying, they're fucking me over again. Even Freud never went beyond this narrow and limited conception of the ego. And what prevented him from doing so was his own tripatriate formula, the Oedipal, neurotic one, daddy, mommy, me. The great discovery of psychoanalysis was that the production of desire, of the productions of the unconscious. But once Oedipus entered the picture, this discovery was soon buried beneath a new brand of idealism. A classical theater was substituted for the unconscious as a factory. Representation was substituted for the units of production and unconscious. And that's sort of an interesting idea he gets to as well, which is that psychoanalysis just almost made like a puppet theater of what's going on in your mind. And that's a criticism that I think people on our side of the political spectrum often give towards psychoanalysis. Like, I've got friends who I agree with. They're correct when they say that psychoanalysis and Freud and all of the psychoanalysis, really, they gave just different words to ideas that were understood centuries, if not even millennia before. Like, they gave us the word unconscious. However, the concept of an unconscious realm existed in some form throughout further back in history. So I understand that completely. However, so I like the idea that what they're saying is psychoanalysis, like, there's something going on in your mind, and what they've done is given like words and faces and masks and characters to it, and made a little fucking puppet show to distract you from what's actually going on. And I think I agree with that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I would agree actually wholeheartedly with that take. And in fact, I think that this is one of those rare instances where you can talk to some like, for instance, I have some friends that I like to talk to from the These People Are Sick podcast. And I mean, like, they're very much crypto, although not very big on the crypto aspect. I think they're more openly kind of commie, tanky kind of folks, but they're willing to acknowledge that of what psychoanalysts do, and that they're actually touching based on things that are much older forms about what's in the mind versus what's in our tangible physical reality, and that they're trying to ascribe a narrative and to make sense of why the concept of like the normal mind isn't working in this specific person, or why they're operating the way that they do, or why they're insecure.
Just to once again reference the Batman, one of my favorite lines from The Dark Knight was said by Harvey Dent, who is really the unsung hero of that entire film. It's easy to get lost in that film, but when he just said, they expected us to be decent men in indecent times. And I always thought about that as I was reading this. I really don't think about Batman that much. It just became a fucking riff for this episode. But the idea that we would all be schizophrenic in this 21st century, if not for this, I think that's the nugget of an idea I really extracted from this. I think people, you can maybe forget a lot of the stuff in this, or understand it but put it to the side. But I do think that there's something to that, and I think it takes a psychoanalysis to really take apart psychiatry, like, not just dismiss it out of hand like some people do, like, that's all bullshit, but really understand why it's bullshit. I think these did as good a job as any. Or like, even when Thomas Zaz, who was the one of the lead psychoanalysts in America, did The Therapeutic State, among other books. Like, it took a guy who was like that top of his game to say, like, no, this is ruining America. And he was saying that in the fucking 50s.
It's funny that you reference the Joker as often as you have, with respects to Batman. But I think that, to get our references here, when we look at psychoanalysis versus schizoanalysis, you also get the comparison for, I guess, the chief figure of their time, or a popular character, that of Charlie Chaplin. So they reference Schreiber again. But they say psychoanalysis settles on the imaginary and structural representation representatives of reterritorialization, while schizoanalysis follows the machinic indices of deterritorialization. The opposition still holds between the neurotic on the couch as the ultimate sterile land, the last exhausted colony, and the schizo out for a walk in a deterritorialized circuit. And they reference, of course, Charlie Chaplin. With respect to the famous short film Modern Times about being a worker in a factory. So when Charlie makes the board fall a second time on his head, a psychotic gesture, he provokes the spectator's laughter. Yes, but what laughter is this, and what spectator? For example, the question no longer applies at all at this point in the film of knowing whether the spectator must see an accident coming or be surprised by it. It is though the spectator at that very moment were no longer in his seat, were no longer in a position to observe things. A kind of perceptive gymnastics has led him progressively not to identify with the character of Modern Times, but to experience so directly the resistance of the events that he accompanies this character. He has the same surprises, the same premonitions, the same habits as he, and thus that famous eating machine, in which, in a sense, by its excesses, is foreign to the film. Chaplin had invented it 22 years before the film, is merely the formal, absolute exercises that prepares for the conduct, also psychotic, of the worker trapped in the machine with only his upside-down head sticking out, and who has Chaplin feed him his lunch since it is lunchtime. If laughter is the reaction that takes certain circuits, it can be said that Charlie Chaplin, as the film sequences unfold, progressively displaces the reactions, causes them to recede level by level, until the moment when the spectator is no longer the master of his own circuits, and tends to spontaneously take either a shorter path, which is not passable, or barred and very explicitly posted elsewhere, and having suppressed as the spectator, Charlie Chaplin perverts the laughter, which comes to be like so many short circuits of a disconnected piece of machinery. And so, one, he's calling out the literally me moment. He's like, listen, man, you're schizo if you're identifying with this literally me, because you're disembodying yourself. You're now becoming disconnected. You have broken the relationship between the viewer and the spectator. You now identify with him. You're now part of this world, and now that you are expecting it, because you yourself are no longer on the sterile couch of psychoanalysis. You're no longer on the sterile, well, they're not really sterile, let's not kid ourselves. You're no longer on the not so sterile movie theater seat. The
psychiatrist casting couch, if you will.
The casting couch with the girlfriend where you cut the hole in the popcorn box. I know what you're doing with the extra butter. So with that, you've now become, on this very small scale, broken these, traditional relationships between viewer and the film and the actor. And instead, what you've now done is become drawn to it and are now a part of a wireless system in which you sort of, psychologically transpose yourself on there, but you're no longer physically rooted. There's no longer those traditional connections. It's been short-circuited.
I got a couple of comments here. I just wanted to call out Vingul said they should all be put on an airplane and flown into an island in the Pacific. They should analyze each other, but they should leave us alone, says Werner Herzog. EL comments, Werner Herzog finding a way to endorse the mustache man with that quote. I want to keep going with schizoanalysis a bit more. I'm looking at a page 315 here. This is a pretty big segment, but it gathers together a few ideas here. It says, the schizoanalytic argument is simple. Desire is a machine, a synthesis of machines, a machinic arrangement, desiring machines. The order of desire is the order of production. All production is at once desiring production and social production. We therefore reproach psychoanalysis for having stifled this order of production, for having shunted it into representation, and that's the sort of the yin and the yang of this right now. There's the desiring machine that's pure, then there's the representation that kind of falls back over it. That sort of is like the last step of it being corrupted by Oedipus. Far from showing the boldness of psychoanalysis, this idea of unconscious representation marks from the outset its bankruptcy or its abnegation, an unconscious that no longer produces, but is content to believe. The unconscious believes in Oedipus. It believes in castration, in the law. Thus, the link between representation belief and the family is not accidental. It is of the essence of representation to be a familial representation, but production is not thereby suppressed. It continues to rumble, to throb beneath a representative agency that suffocates it, and that in return can make resonate to the breaking point. The production couple, the desiring machines, and the social field gives way to a representative couple out of an entirely different nature, family myth. Why was the mythic and tragic representation accorded such a senseless privilege? Why were expressive forms and a whole theater installed where there were fields, workshops, factories, units for production? The psychoanalysis parks his circus in the dumbfounded unconscious, a real P.T. Barnum in the fields and in the factories. Psychoanalysis does treat myth and tragedy, but it treats them as the dreams and the fantasies of private man, homo familia. And in fact, dream and fantasy are to myth and tragedy as private property and public property. What acts in myth and tragedy at the level of objective elements is therefore reappropriated and raised to a higher level by psychoanalysis and as an unconscious dimension of subjective representation, myth as humanity's dream. And I like that because to me it was just a fusion of the psychoanalytic and then the mythological and the economic all in one burst. And so what do you think about that statement?
Yeah, I think that it dives into what psychoanalysts are trying to do, which you had mentioned it earlier, and I think it was from one of the comments in chat, that this is attempting to apply narrative to the subconscious. This is trying to apply narrative to what we feel and what we think. And they expand on this quite clearly, that psychoanalysis is trying to break down the understanding of the, and they mentioned this in the chapter earlier, like this is the Greek amphitheater of the mind. This is the Hellenistic Western expression of the world. And in fact, the dreams and fantasies of private man are now the myth and tragedies of society writ large. This is why, and you see this being applied even in other forms of media, like in the episode about Lucky Strike in Mad Men, where that Peter, that balding Norwood piece of shit, is like, well, we'll just use the lady's death wish analysts, and we'll use death wish as our way to like sell cigarettes. And Don Draper's like, well, that's retarded. Don't do that. But like that's the interpretation, though. It's just that like these private desires, these private tragedies. So we want to re-territorialize it into death, into narrative, into myth. And that's what makes it so great. Well, then all of a sudden you realize that that's all that psychoanalysts are ever trying to do, is trying to apply a mythology and a narrative in which you can manipulate to sell shit. And that's where you get sort of like, well, this is what capitalism does. And anyone who's considered schizophrenic or someone who doesn't want to obey by the encoded desire because of lack, well, then all of a sudden you're considered a crazy person. You can't be a part of that society. Your libido doesn't work with what humanity's dream is. And so if you can't be part of this universality of what man is supposed to be or what European persons are supposed to produce, then there's no use for you. And instead you need to be thrown off the stage.
Absolutely. Now I've got another part I can read here that kind of wraps that up. Now let me just see here. 337. And I think it really emphasizes, here we go. So in its destructive task, schizoanalysis must proceed as quickly as possible, but it can also proceed only with great patience, great care, by successively undoing the representative territorialities and re-territorializations through which the subject passes in his individual history. And we keep seeing the phrase territorialization here, and I think we probably discussed that in the first episode, but I find that they use re-territorialization completely differently than we would. Or maybe we use it the same way, but one just sees it as bad. Like to them, re-territorialization, like rediscovering yourself, is the worst thing you can do. You must destroy yourself. You must destroy anything that you want to rediscover. In fact, the very desire you have to rediscover something in yourself, in your people's history, in your culture, whatever, that is the problem. So, I've heard re-territorialization said in the positive on our side. So it's just interesting seeing it here as the main problem. He says, For there are several layers, several planes of resistance that come from within or are imposed from without. Schizophrenia as a process, deterritorialization as a process, is inseparable from the stases that interrupt it or aggravate it or make it turn in circles and re-territorialize it into neurosis, perversion, and psychosis. And it should be said that repeatedly in the book, they describe neurosis and perversion and psychosis as bad. It's not like perversion and psychosis is something you should run towards either. So it's I want to be clear that they're not saying just try and grasp at any sort of antisocial mental illness that you can to attack the center of society. It's not that. It really is just schizophrenia. In fact, paranoia, neurosis, autism, all of that is just someone who's been psychoanalyzed so much and they believe they're trapped within the Oedipal triangle so much that they can never escape it. And they become their own prison warden in that sense. He continues, it should therefore be said that one can never go far enough in the direction of deterritorialization. You haven't seen anything yet, an irreversible process. And when we consider what there is of a profoundly artificial nature that perverted reterritorialization, but also the psychotic reterritorializations of the hospital, or even in the familial neurotic reterritorialization, we cry out more perversion, more artifice, to a point where the earth becomes so artificial that the movement of deterritorialization creates of necessity and by itself a new earth. So that's actually how I believe the book ends, very clearly what they're trying to accomplish. And there's more we could even talk about in social repression, but I love that last line, more perversion, more artifice, to the point where the earth becomes so artificial, accelerationism, that we basically create a new earth. And this is kind of where you like, by necessity, you get into very sci-fi flights of fancy once you get deep into this stuff. But yeah, I didn't read anywhere in this book an outright like a practical way that one could begin to initiate this process. Maybe they get into that in the second book. But
they talk a little bit about it because there is more, at least in my copy of the text, about what this would look like or what is the task. And so, the section after that is talking about the first positive task of schizoanalysis. And
if you want to give the page number, I got yours up on screen right now.
174 on the PDF. And I just have a few notes on this, and it's going to be, that's where the chapter is, but I think that where I had my notes is, let me just Control F real quick here, and it's actually not too far. Oh, there it is. Okay, so it would start right down here at the bottom. Therefore, let us return. Let us therefore return to the rules so clearly stated by Serge Leclerc, even if he sees this only as a fiction instead of the real desire. The elements or parts of desiring machines are recognized by their mutual independence, such that nothing in one depends or should depend on something in the other. They must not be opposed determinations of the same entity, nor differentiations of the single being, such as the masculine and the feminine in the human sex, but different or really distinct things. Distinct beings found in the dispersion of the non-human sex, the clover and the bee. As long as schizoanalysis has not arrived at these disparate elements, it has not yet discovered the partial objects as the ultimate elements of the unconscious. In this sense, that Leclerc used the term erogenous body, not to designate a fragmented organism, but an emission of pre-individual, pre-personal singularities, a pure, dispersed, anarchic multiplicity without unity or totality, and whose elements are welded, pasted together by the real distinction, or the very absence of a link. Such is the case of the schizoid sequences of Beckett's, stones, pockets, mouth, a shoe, a pipe bowl, a small limp bundle that is undefined, a cover for a bicycle bell, half a crutch. If one indefinitely runs up against the same set of pure singularities, one can feel confident that he is drawn near the singularity of the subject's desire. To be sure, one can always establish or re-establish some sort of link between these elements, organic links between organs or fragments of organs that eventually form a part of a multiplicity, psychological, axiological links, good, bad. that finally referred to persons or scenes from which these elements are borrowed, structural links between the ideas and concepts that are apt to correspond to them. But it is not in this respect that the partial objects are elements of the unconscious. We cannot even go along with the image of partial objects that their inventor Melanie Klein proposes. This is because whether organs or fragments are organs, the partial objects do not refer to at least an organism that would function phantasmically as a lost unity or a totality to come. Their dispersion has nothing to do with lack, and it constitutes their mode of presence and multiplicity. They form without unification or totalization. With every structure dislodged, every memory abolished, every organism set aside, every link undone, they function as raw partial objects, dispersed working parts of a machine that itself is dispersed. In short, partial objects are the molecular functions of the unconscious. That is why, when we insisted earlier on the difference between desiring machines and all figures of molar machines, we were fully aware that they were both contained in and did not exist without one another. But we had to stress the difference in regime and scale between the two machinic species. First step on all of this is to simply say that what we are looking at is a society in which we have to break down things in a way in which we have to break it down to a quantum level. If we can break down the parts of atoms, if we can break down the parts of even what's inside of subatomically like quarks and whatnot, we also have to break down these linkages and elements that we would assemble together in our mind. This is why assemblage theory, this is why structuralism gets thrown out the window. And we have to understand that all these flows cannot be linked as some sort of faction or some sort of understanding of what makes a family unit, what makes an element of what person actually wants, because that can be encoded somewhere else. And instead, all things have to be de-individuated. And once these things are de-individuated and these connections of all these partial objects are indirect, they're not really human, they're not in a way that you and I would look at them, these flows break into two different lines of thought. This is where you get the body without organs. And all this allows you to basically testify and say, okay, now we no longer have to look at the world and instead, oh, yes, now we can look at it and understand that we ourselves are not going to be, stripped of what our original thoughts are or what our original desires may be from lack, but instead they can be brought together in a way that no longer makes us, what we would consider human. And in fact, they break this part down with, ironically, in the next section about Mozart and more about asses and whatnot.
Okay, I was going to read that. And I'm glad you saw it because,
I knew it was coming. I took notes on this. I was just like, yes, the French conclusion to all problems, which is eating ass.
Like, I was just reading the quote here, and I started reading it in like a Bronze Age pervert voice. It's like, raise your ass to your mouth. My ass burns like fire. But what can the meaning of that? What can be the meaning of that? Perhaps a turd wants to come out. Yes, turd. I know you. I see you. I feel you. What is this? Is such a thing possible? Like, what a fucking thing to say. Did you have any thoughts on that?
Other than just sort of like the fetishistic aspect of it all, I mean, not too much, but other than to simply say that for them to engage in a mode of death, i.e. a way in which we would see our world like, oh, he's dead to the world, but not in the Christian sense of being dead to the world, but dead to a capitalistic society. They take this anti-production, and instead they want to use that as a way in which we can be free from organ object, meaning and assignment, object descriptor. And in doing so, we allow ourselves to not be a producing machine, a desiring machine. We are instead a paranoiac machine. And when we engage in these paranoiac, systems and structures that are not structures, but are de-individuated and non-organized, but they multiply somehow because they're non-organic. What comes from that really is the shattered organism, the shattered parts of the world, the shatteredness of an object that can direct its powers to change the system that is no longer intensifying on capital or desiring to produce because we feel this need to build, but instead we allow ourselves to grow in this molecular chain that allows us to be free, at least in their understanding. We're now converting this energy of production and allowing it to be an energy that will record the world around us. We can be part of it in a way that is not the whole, but parts of the whole that enable us to no longer be part of a flow of production.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to put it. And you described before about how this makes you into something less than human. I was laughing at the phrase, what did he mean by this, being, that's kind of what he was getting at there with that whole sense we were laughing at, like the very idea of trying to analyze and understand and unpack things. That is us trying to code and code and code and understand things. And that's really what we need to try and get away from. And I think, like you had said, it does give you a version of what they want. And I do, because we're getting up to the end of this, I think we've covered most of what we wanted to cover.
Yeah.
But I did want to ask you, and I don't want to be too reductive when I say this, but they have some very interesting ideas in here, but I think their analysis is inhibited by a fairly simplified conceptualization of what like a machine is. Like everything comes back to a machine, and they're understanding a machine. Well, it's just parts. It's parts that fit together, which is very like industrial revolution, like you had mentioned, modern times.
Yeah, it's very
whichever.
limited to that Marxist understanding of industrialism.
Yeah.
Although I will, to give Deleuze and Guattari credit, like they write on this more later in their lives. I mean, Deleuze especially, just because he lived longer. But you know, he himself would sort of look at the world, especially when he talks about like. I think, for instance, if you've had the chance to read, and this is actually much older work, but if you read Difference and Repetition, which is, it's more of a metaphysical treatise, which is, I think, goes a lot more into sort of this, position about, what does it mean to be in a machinic society, and why do we repeat these things? And not just through generality, but also through why we engage in them on a societal level. I think I think it helps in that respect, but in this book especially, and I mean, on 1,000 Plateaus, I would need to reread it. But here we see this very limited structure about they're working with Marx, like that's what they're kind of stuck within, sort of the worldview of what Marx is defining as capitalism. And they themselves are also applying it through the lens of psychoanalysis. So you're working within two very limited worldviews, especially now in 2024. This book is, 50 years old at this point, and so much has changed since then, that on one hand, I can see a lot of this still being applicable, because we've noticed how, when we were describing earlier what capital does, or in their viewpoint, capitalism does, it takes things that are not saleable, things that cannot be used for production, and capital will find a way to do it. And if it can't do that, it will encode a sense of taboo, or a sense of negative connotation to it. And we kind of see
it's
that
saying
already.
It's useless. It's not worth having a price attached to it.
Well, it's not even that it's not worth having a price attached to it. It's that capital hasn't figured out a way to exploit it yet. It hasn't found a way to make a good example would be like the hikikomori, right? Like no one knows how to make the like neat, stay at home, jerk off to anime guy all day. They haven't figured out a way to make him a fully productive member of society yet, because his desire is to just like goon his life away. And
podcasters have.
Yeah, right. Podcasters have, because somehow you people are lovingly listening to us and finding a way to listen to us talk about the turd coming out of Mozart's ass, and somehow you find that endearing, but also enlightening. So on one hand, like this text, I think, has a lot that still applies, but at the same time, it skips over things that are just hard-coded reality, because they take these things into metaphysical abstractions, and it becomes this very almost idealized counterfactual. They're like, well, what if we got rid of the metaphysical understanding that we can, bring about through societies of control and production? And instead, what if we live in a world where we were all these like disjointed partial forms, and we resisted capital, and there go the death of fascism, and oppression is over? But it's just like, well, that's not going to really stop the people who don't believe in your nonsense from ever like coming over and taking over and killing you. It's the thing which I find so interesting about how like the theory cell has kind of died in 2024. Because it's like, yeah, this theory stuff's cool and the abstraction's nice, but it's like, bro, the enemy's at the gates. Like, there are like 200,000 Indians running this McDonald's outside of like Montreal. I have
a lot of Indians.
Problems to do.
They got 2,000 Indians running one McDonald's. That's such a funny idea. Just they can't fucking serve any food. There's just so many of them. I actually talked about this in that speech I talked about in Toronto. which me and Distributist and many others gave speeches there. I said there's a segment about the sensitive young man, about how it's easy to get lost in these labyrinths of theories, and it becomes obvious that these are just another type of fandom. That you're engaging with theory and esoteric knowledge the same way someone might really get into Rick and Morty lore, or Rick and Morty esoteric, erotic lore, right? It's just a thing you consume. You're a consumer still. And at a certain point, you must ask yourself, for what purpose am I consuming this? What can be done with this? I think there are some ideas in here that can be repurposed, but I really like that statement you just had about the theory cell is dying in 2024, because at a certain point, you're saying, what the fuck am I doing? How is this any different than a Marvel movie? Really? Is it just a weirder version of that? Am I collecting esoteric knowledge like Funko Pops? But I do think there is something that can be learned from this. However, you really have to dig it apart, I think. And the funny thing is, like we had said at the very, very beginning, one thing you can take away from this is fascism is inevitable. Really, like, I take them at their word when they say that. But there's also, what I just said, that
I'm waiting, man. I'm waiting.
one thing I became transfixed on is their understanding of the universe as machines, and small machines, meaning these looping mechanisms. And I remember explaining to someone they couldn't understand electronic music or hip hop, or the idea of a loop, that you take a piece of music and loop it, rather than like a piece of classical music or jazz or any other type of music, really, that kind of flows. But some people think that's a very reductive and stupid way to make music, but I'm like, no, it's a very 20th century way to make music. The idea you can take something complex, localize it, repeat it, and just have it run autonomously, and then you stack several of those together. There was an idea where that sort of idea did exist. You couldn't explain that to someone like 300 years ago. It's too odd an idea. So, like, I do see where they're coming from. They say, well, in a sense, the entire universe are these autonomous little machines just running a looping sequence and passing flows of information. Okay, I kind of get that. And they're animated in the way that Schopenhauer would describe the will. Like, they're just doing things because they want to do things. So really, this book is trying to explain what that will is. The will is just this sort of baseline desire to do something. Like, you get why they have the word desire rather than will, because will is forceful, but desire has almost an intent behind it. So it's at an extra level above. So the entire universe has an intent to exist. Well, that's an interesting idea. I don't hate that idea. And I don't hate that you're basically trying to say that particles have an intent. Particles have a desire. That's kind of cool. And that they can become sort of corrupted by overanalysis. And maybe because if something has a conscious, almost sovereign intent, then it can almost rewrite its own history, right? So you're almost coding like an intelligence onto the building blocks of life. Like, okay, that's cool. That's interesting. And I do agree that maybe capitalism is the runaway extreme of what happens when that system becomes aware of itself and begins overanalyze itself again and again and again. And like McLuhan said, when he was discussing the evolution of the concept of time, that time in ancient societies was much more fluid. Of course, you could record time. Of course, you had sundials. Of course, you had water clocks and whatnot. But the idea of a minute or a second or an hour as a container of activity and value, and if that container of value has no value in it, then you are wasting time. That's a really fucking weird idea, isn't it? And that as in the 21st century, we start to measure our time down to the second, even on an individual level. So like, I do get where they're coming from. They are, at the end of the day, and I really believe this, describing a phenomena that we all live in. And guess what? I don't hate the idea that this is a society that seems to produce schizophrenics, and those schizophrenics are locked into stasis by runaway psychoanalysis. However, I might disagree with that. The natural state or the desired state is more schizophrenia. What do you think about that?
I think that you, as well as the authors, are right that we have witnessed through both the Industrial Revolution, but also just sort of everything being monetized, commodified, and gamified, a totally revamped understanding of time. And we kind of got into this too with respects to spinal catastrophism. We talked about railway spine, that the human body was not used to moving as fast as it did or adjusting to the vibrations of the rail car on the rail tracks, that they went catatonic and then they went insane. And we can produce even now in the society sort of like these amorphous blobs that have no real understanding or place in the world. And you have to ask yourself, what do we do with these people? The soul, people that we would call the bug man, or people that some would even just say soulless. And there is this great reinterpretation, especially in the last 250 years, where time is now just this pure form of commodity, where it is sort of either A, enjoy yourself, or B, produce, make, build, grow, hustle, grind, etc. Whereas both the ancients, both pre-Christian and Christian, had a pretty deep and wonderful understanding of what our time is for. And that we don't have a lot of it, and we know that at any point in time it can be taken away from us. You read both pagan writings themselves, like, oh, well, the life and not knowing our death is actually a great gift for us to enjoy the fullness of it and to seek our great glory. That way, when we do die, people will remember us being part of our life and being able to tell its story effectively. Or even in the Christian sense, that you do not know when the master returns. He can come like a thief in the night, and is often sung in various service, behold, the bridegroom cometh in the middle of the night. Blessed is the servant who keeps watch. That is totally taken away in a context where rise, grind, eat, sleep, replete, reduce, produce, goon, whatever, anything that might be there. It's all there for the explicit purpose of production. Because, your ability to be a desiring machine means that you're going to take part of this Dracula vampiric flow in which all things must be stolen from you. Your vril is being stolen from you. Your life is being stolen from you. Your chance to repent is being stolen from you because it isn't part of the concept of production, which is why I kind of find it funny looking at this in sort of this in a Christian perspective is like, they kind of understand that like the world, i.e. like the prince of this world, ain't good for you. But also your idea of being dead to the world is far more, dare I say, schizophrenic, dare I say, lack of making sense than even sort of the Christian context of being dead to the world. Because death to the world is death to the passions. It's death to the things that would want us to be part of this desire machine flow. But for them, they want to take that even further and say, no, God's not real. The Sky Daddy is dumb because it's a method of controlling you. So instead, you should just eat ass like Mozart and break away from the assemblages and move on from a society that is capitalistic, fascistic, and thus free yourself from power by that liberation. But as we kind of tell from our reading of this and also just sort of the breakdown of it, it leaves you wondering how much of that can actually be feasible. And this is where you get the discussion about desire, nomadology, the sort of different Deleuzian readings from Justin Murphy and our friend Last Things. But even then, that form of piracy and nomadology, which kind of works kind of well with Bap's idea of being the nomad, but also it doesn't, it sort of still leaves you as an outsider to a system that will try its best to treat you as an enemy, treat you as an outsider, and try its best to institutionalize you, or as we've seen so adequately with the right in the United States and in Canada elsewhere, put you in jail for simply saying, there are too many fucking Indians here.
Yeah, and you made a great point there. I just wanted to circle back to where you said, and this is the reason we care about this, that we can be with many of these authors on the same track for quite some time and agree on maybe some foundational premises and issues, but there's always a fork. There's always, what do you call a fork in a track? I'm not a railway guy, but the paths diverge. And the paths diverge where, like you had just said, one side, our side, seeks the transcendent. We agree all the issues with modernity, with the prison, the hellscape we live in, whatever it might be. But we still have the desire to seek out something transcendent, something true, something real behind all this, something eternal even, which is why many of us, even those who are devout Christians, also have a deep fascination with mythology. Even someone like E. Michael Jones who's a Catholic, of course, in his Logos Rising book, like he goes back to the Greeks. He goes back as far as he can to trace some of these old ideas. Anyway, we detect that there's something there that we can investigate or attain. Whereas these guys, they say just destroy it all because they don't believe in truth. In fact, the desire to seek out truth itself is the problem, is what they're saying. Like you need to want insane destruction. That's what this is, and that's why it's so similar to spinal catastrophism. Like I really do think both of these books, indeed most of the literature that emerges from the space, I'm not sure Zizek does, because I read Incontinence of the Void, so he might take a different approach. However, just like with spinal catastrophism, this ends with destruction, basically. Like you need to gloriously pursue destruction of everything that you are. And so again, like once you cut all this stuff away, the prescription, the solution is I can't go with them on that. I can't go with them down that track. You know, I don't think that's ever something we can reconcile with that side. So it's not an issue of definitions. It's not an issue of, you know, we're saying the same thing in a different way. No, like I really do think there's within the fucking DNA of us and our opponents, there's something different. And I don't think we could ever be friends at that level for people who take these ideas as seriously as these two do anyway.
Yeah, and it is interesting that even, you know, to go back to mythology, for them, they just see this as this like eternal recurrence, you know, this eternal return to forms of power and control. Although for us, we go back to what came before as a method to see what has existed in forms in which has kept us sane, but has kept us on there. I mean, even in times in early Christianity, I mean, like Saint Basil the Great has a whole address to young men on Greek literature. You know, how you're actually going to benefit from reading like the pagans and to see the great poets and philosophers and see how that brings you to where you are now in this Christian age. Like, the same thing for us. We want to go back and we want to look upon, but we also have to look upon the writings that kind of form the basis of our enemies. And that to a large extent also includes reading these books, because that requires us to look at how did they get here? How did we get here? And what are they looking at the world now? And what can we benefit from it? And what can we avoid? You know, there are good things to take from this stuff, particularly I think with respects to what they wish to break away from, or some of the problems that capitalism does have. Even though Marx and these guys have some very valid critiques of the system, doesn't mean that their solutions are correct. You know, there's still a lot that on this side of things we can learn from. Now, the question, and this is what I think makes it so interesting about right-wingers reading this stuff, and I'm sure that you might agree with me here, Dimes, is that we don't have the same praxis in mind with respects to taking these ideas away from it, because we're rooted in something transcendent, something that has tangible biological reality, and something that has been proved by just proof of concept and proof of life in history throughout all of human existence. And so, you know, with that, we kind of have the home field advantage of just, oh, our shit actually works.
Well, like we had said at the very beginning, when they're talking about the root of this problem being in the family from the very early stages, even passively, even unconsciously, well, that is it, isn't it? That is the problem. Like our thing is generative. Our thing is the root of everything. If you want to agree that, yes, this all emerges from the family formation and the birth of hierarchy and these relationships within the household, and then that expands outward in concentric circles into hierarchies of larger and larger complexity, and as we make our own machines and we create these vast systems of thought and analysis. Like, yeah, it's true. It actually does start with that, and we can trace the line. I just don't agree that that's bad, and I don't agree that it's like if we do agree that it's always going to advance, like there is an accelerationist sense here, and I believe they outright say like you need to increase this complexity until it collapses on itself and makes everyone schizophrenic. Well, then, you know, it's communists love saying this fucking thing that their utopia is inevitable. Well, then I guess we'll wait, because you can't do anything about it. You can't do anything to stop this. Not really. The only solution you have is to just like go insane and go with the flow. That's really what schizoanalysis is just like, okay, just decouple from all meaning and just you're the king of interpreting things. That's what it is. Like, people give you one word, you turn it around in your head, and you say something else until they don't want to talk to you anymore. That's what a schizoanalysis is. Like, you're something that cannot function within the system, and then people just leave you alone, I guess. So you're just an insane hobo eventually. And if there's enough insane hobos who don't know how to do anything, then I guess society fixes itself. You know what I mean? Like, that part's not serious, I don't think. But the seriousness that they're grappling with is that they're looking at their communist Marxist project and saying, well, this didn't work. Well, it didn't work because it can't fucking work. And they're, like I said, at least they're taking it seriously, that none of their economic paradigms, none of their fucking solutions to the problem of class can ever fucking work unless reality is torn down and reconstituted in a new fucking seed that they planned, which is called, I guess, horny schizophrenia, talking about fucking butts and asses all the time.
You know, and it's funny. My mind is immediately thinking of like the Cloward Piven or Cloward Piven strategy. You know, just like, oh, just accelerate the system so it collapses so we can get wealth redistribution. Well, it turns out that the system would rather just like euthanize you and replace you with like an immigrant from the third world before it dare try and collapse into itself.
I do wonder, like, you read the second book.
Oh, like years ago. It has been so long since I've read Thousand Plateaus.
I do wonder what they would say with the 21st century, you know, reality that we live in. I wonder how, and I'm asking very openly, like, what they would. Do you think that anything we're experiencing now would challenge anything that they believe?
I mean, I think that they would, at least in the Thousand Plateaus, one of the things that I really do remember, and that this is where you get more of the rhizomatic stuff, and then also, you know, some of them, of course, are talking about the face. There's a whole chapter on like the face, faciality, and just talking about how like we use the face to overcode the body, but it's also in tension with like the world around us, specifically our geography, the landscape. I think that they would probably have a lot more to say, especially now towards the changing landscape, not just like actual geography, but also the changing landscape of what is the social contract today. Because they spend so much time again focusing on the psychoanalysts that I don't think that I think they would have a lot more to say about the expectations of a society on the mind as the changing social contract. Like, I can only imagine how much shit they would have to say about COVID. I can only imagine about like the essential worker.
Zizek wrote 2 fucking books on it while it was happening.
Well, you know, and we haven't decided what our next book is going to be. Although you and I were having some discussions about that. It'd be fun to go into Zizek on that on one of his COVID books.
Our problem is we have so many that we actually have like
many
options. It's just which one to do first.
I think your initial suggestion, sorry to get off topic, but like I think your initial suggestion that we pick like a Ta-Nehisi Coates or one of these like big race grifter books and take it seriously, I think that would actually be very good.
That would be so fun. Like, that's something I've wanted to do for a while, just so people get a sneak peek on the next one. Everyone's aware of these anti-white books, and they're called, you know, sometimes explicitly anti-whiteness, but white fragility would be one. Anything by Ta-Nehisi Coates, I've never read them. I think a lot of people on our space, like, we instinctually hate it, as we should, but I've never actually looked at the arguments they make. I've seen them in interviews, and you're probably familiar with them, but like, what do they really say? And I want to let's find maybe the best one. I don't know how you would quantify that, but there's got to be, like, this is just, we're gonna have some fun. I think
you're right. I think that we'll find one and we'll make the announcement towards the new year which one we're going to cover. But do you have any final thoughts here, Dimes, on what we've read?
I thought I had one, but I just forgot it. But I did say 99% of what I wanted to say. But yeah, like as we were talking, it really became clear about how, you know, the very idea, I think this is what makes it real appealing. Like, the idea of love would be like the problem to them. Anyway, so yeah, I think that's about, I said pretty much everything I needed to say, and I don't think I have any more notes I wanted to cover. oh, here's an idea from Zaleski. The anti-racist baby is a heavy hitter. We might do that. That's a short one, but we might do that.
Isn't that just like a child's like book?
Yeah, and I've seen that one where I buy my child's books too. Like, I don't know. Also, here's a Shaver. Deleuze didn't become a homeless schizophrenic. I don't think this guy really believed what he wrote. I mean, fair enough, right?
Ah, that's very true.
Now, what are your final thoughts on this?
You know, I think that out of all of what we've read here, I think one of the things that really sticks out to me is going to be about trying to understand our relationship to the world. Because I mean, this fundamentally is a very metaphysical book, and it sort of and it takes along the lines of Nietzsche, and it takes along the lines of what Freud and other psychoanalysts are taking here, which is that, you know, clearly these complexes are part of our society, and we can deconstruct them. We can put them on the public stage to explain universal human traits and symptoms. Now, of course, that's very the criticism that you would see nowadays is that's very, very Eurocentric. That's very much of like the European mind, because you can't really apply that in globally due to human biodiversity and different ways of perceiving the world. Because you can read science fiction in the West, like Asimov or Orson Scott Card, and then you can read Cixin Liu's, you know, Three Body Problem. Those are two different like species writing similar, you know, novels in science fiction, which is a great series to read if you want to understand how the Chinaman thinks. But with respects to this book, I think that it's really interesting to look at what do we, you know, when people say, oh, it's so like, oh, that's so schizo, it's so schizoanalysis. Well, really, you've reduced the terminology to just mean like, oh, what a contrarian, like cabal, you know, conspiracy-minded way to look at the world, which in some instance is true, but you're not deconstructing it enough. Instead, what you're doing is looking for links. You're looking for patterns. You're still participating in the oppressive aspect of society that Deleuze and Guattari are critiquing. But overall, I mean, these books are still worth reading because these are still the formulations in which people look at the world today. Philosophers cite Deleuze and Guattari all the time, and you kind of have to understand these people to some extent if you want to understand where we're going next, because we are brought upon by links and assemblies and by these causal inferences in society that play out on a stage that is the internet, where we're all in this void of screams and we're all screaming at the top of our lungs, praying to some unknown entity in this digital ayahuasca astral plane that someone will hear us. And we've been blessed. Dimes and I are very blessed to have an audience, and we're thankful for it. But at the same time, we know that there are much louder screams or much quieter screams that can only be heard on certain frequencies that will tell you this is the way the messages are going to go. Behind every breaking news that's on Twitter that's usually drama related, there's a small cabal of group chats that are half-cocked and working on plans to make it happen. And I think that when you read books like this allows you to sort of disassociate from a little bit of what we're told is the world, and instead recontextualize it in a way that allows us to understand maybe things are not what they seem, and maybe we should be looking at it in a contrarian, anti-way. But for Deleuze and Guattari, I mean, at the end of it all, it's all about power and control. But we know on the right, being on the side of order, being on the side of truth, being on the side of God, that is not the end result that we want. But it's important to understand these self-destructive chiliastic tendencies, lest we fall into the delusion that maybe they have a point and we should pursue these logical conclusions.
And one thing that even Foucault points out in Madness and Civilization, here I go citing Foucault, but he viewed the psychoanalytic relationship, the therapist chair, as just the latest in a long chain of prisons. Whereas historically you had exile or, you know, from the community, then you had imprisoned, like we're going to keep you here. But the psychoanalyst's chair, the therapist chair, is a way, it's a different type of, it's a constant interrogation your entire life, because you can stop being a criminal, but you can never stop being mentally ill. So you're always imprisoned, not only being interrogated by your therapist, but eventually interrogating yourself. So, you know, one of the reasons that we came to this, I mentioned this right at the top about the friend of mine asked me about like the body without organs and stuff. Like, what does it mean to be Deleuzian? And I guess that's really what drove me to want to read books like this, which is the same drive that Deleuze and Guattari went on, which is why do people keep voting for fascists? Why do people like fascism? What is it in here that explains this thing that shouldn't be existing according to us? So I wanted to answer the question, like, why in 2024, going into 2025, do we have terms like Deleuzian? And schizoanalysis is a funny thing because you had correctly just pointed out that people will use the term schizophrenic when they mean to say neurotic, or they, neurotic is someone that creates, who laser focuses on these systems and creates these vast balconies and constructs to explain something. It's very autistic. Schizo is the opposite of that. It's just taking the world as it is. So people just completely inverted the definition of schizoanalysis, but it doesn't matter. Why do we still have that term? And I want to solve, and I believe you do too, what is it about these ideas, these books, this idea, anything that ends with Ian, like Deleuzian, Faustian, whatever, what is it in the organism of this idea that has withstood the entropy of our civilization, of our society? Why is it relevant? Because it clearly is. If something is popular, I don't think we have the privilege or the power to just say it's popular because people are stupid. It's random why it's popular. No. When something is popular, when it has stood the test of time, there's something there that makes it relevant. And you should at least try to understand what it is. It doesn't really make sense that Marxism should be as popular as it is. However, if we're going to be serious, we have to try and unpack why that is. There is something in there that you can't just dismiss, or you dismiss it at your peril, because it will just take a different form. It will evolve. And what we're looking at here is Marxism that has evolved over the course of the 20th century, and it didn't fucking stop evolving, and it's still being reworked right now by Marxist intellectuals because for some fucking reason, I guess it's still relevant, and maybe we can actually understand what that is and not let it just keep mutating until, maybe these people end up in power someday. Maybe you get a JD Vance who wasn't raised on Vitalist Substacks or whatever the fuck. Maybe he was raised on this stuff, and that's a real problem. So that's why, I'm into it. Or I think people should at least try.
Yeah, absolutely. And we should absolutely be the ones to try and make sense of it. Because when someone says, oh, this is the way to look at the world, you kind of have to understand, what does that mean? And that's kind of why we're here, to answer that question. Like, well, it's in this book. That's what we mean by that. It's like, well, do you even read it? And it's a play on words, but also at the same time, we actually do want to understand these things. But there was a super chat that came in from Cal of Night for €249. Thank you, sir. He says, read. Sadly, no, too addicted to trash, working on them. Well, don't blame you. Don't blame you. That's why you're here, and we appreciate it. But I think that I think that the book that we'll read for next month and take it seriously is Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. I think that'll be the one we cover.
I'm just excited to finally read this. It's going to be so fun because it won't be impenetrable. It's going to sound like a big fucking dummy explaining like nonsense. But anyway, like it's taken seriously, I guess, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's a good place to cover it.
All right. This was I had a great time. I hope everyone else did too. I believe we actually covered pretty much everything that is worth covering in this book. Don't be repressed by this, people. Don't let it get inside your head. I've had some people contact me saying this really got them all twisted up. Don't let this really shatter the foundations of your world. Just have fun with it. I think if you can't do it on your own, we'll do it with us, and then we'll hold your hand and we'll get through all this together.
Yeah, reading these books is a lot like the first rule of gun safety. You have to have fun with it. And if you're not having fun with it, then you're not having a good time at the range, and you're not having a good time reading schizophrenic analysis.
All right, man. So I'll let you go. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you for all the great comments. I'm loving the comment section of these streams. So we'll see you next time.